Hello there, my friend. I'm glad you found your way back here tonight. Wherever you are, whatever kind of day brought you all the way to this quiet moment. You probably picture the end of the last ice age as something slow. A glacier melting inch by inch, century after century, so gradual that nobody alive would have noticed a thing. That is not what happened. In some places on this planet, the climate flipped from deep winter to something close to today's world in less time than most people spend living in the same house. Whole coastlines vanished. Entire ways of life ended mid-sentence without warning. And tonight we go looking for what got left behind. Before we step into tonight's story, let me ask for something small. If quiet stories like this one have started finding their way into your bedtime, then tapping that like button and following along here helps this little corner of the internet keep finding its way back to you too. And if your eyes are still open enough to type, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you're sitting right now. I love picturing all of you scattered across so many different clocks, all settling into the very same story at completely different hours. There is a membership option below as well for anyone who ever wants to support this channel a little further, though there is never any pressure attached to that at all. For now, dim the lights if you can. Let a fan hum, or the rain outside, or whatever soft sound tonight happens to offer. Get comfortable. What we're about to look at might change the way you look at the ground under your own feet. Tonight we're going back to the years when the world stopped following its own rules. We will stand in our minds beside an ice sheet taller than any building you have ever walked into. We will watch enormous animals, some heavier than a delivery truck, disappear from the earth within a few thousand years and sit with the gentle argument scientists are still having about why. We will follow a piece of stone that may or may not have fallen out of the sky. We will step inside a temple older than farming itself, built by people who supposedly were not even capable of building anything like it yet. And by the end of this journey, we will trace every bit of it back into your own body, sitting exactly where you are right now. But strangely enough, it all starts on a fishing boat. It is a September night in 1931 in the cold, dark water of the southern North Sea, about 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk, England, near a stretch of shallow seabed called the Lehman and Ower Banks. A small steam trawler named the Calinda rocks gently on the swell. Her crew has spent the whole night dragging nets along the sea floor hoping for herring. It is loud, wet, repetitive work. Nets go down, nets come up. Fish get sorted, nets go down again. Nobody on board expects anything unusual. They have done this 1,000 times before. But this time, tangled in among the fish, the net brings up something else too. A heavy, dark lump of compressed peat. The kind of ancient plant matter trawler. Men out here already have a name for moorlog. For years, crews working these waters have been dragging up chunks of it without a second thought, sometimes even burning it in the ship's stove to stay warm through a long night, never once wondering what it actually is or why it is sitting on the bottom of the sea at all. Because here is the thing about peat. It does not form underwater. It forms on dry land slowly over thousands of years out of dead moss and roots, pressed flat under their own weight. Not this time. The skipper that night, a man named Pilgrim Lockwood, picks up a shovel to break the lump apart and tossed it back overboard the same as always. He swings once, and the shovel strikes something hard inside it, something that does not sound like peat at all. It sounds to his ear almost like metal, which out here usually just means somebody finally lost a wrench overboard. Here's what he finds instead. Wedged inside that block of ancient plant matter is a smooth carved piece of antler about 8.5 inches long, with a neat row of barbs cut along one edge sharp enough even after everything it has been through to still draw blood. This is not driftwood. This is not some strange rock shaped by chance. Someone made this on purpose with real skill a long, long time ago. Lockwood does not throw this one back. He wraps it carefully and carries it home, and it eventually makes its way into the hands of archaeologists at Norwich Castle Museum, then in front of specialists at the British Museum in London. For men used to examining flint tools scraped up on dry English fields, holding a harpoon point that had spent thousands of years sealed under the middle of open sea is something close to disorienting. When those experts study the piece properly, they identify it as a Maglemosian harpoon point, the kind of tool a hunter would have used to catch eels or spearfish in shallow water. They place its age somewhere in a wide window between roughly 6,000 and 12,000 years old. Here's what's strange about a number like that. Underneath that exact spot, 120 feet of cold grey seawater now sits directly above the place where somebody once stood on solid dry ground, carving that very point by hand, most likely thinking about the next day's hunt and nothing more than that. This was not always open water. This was once part of a real living landscape, threaded with rivers, reed beds and rolling hills stretching for miles between what is now Britain and the rest of mainland Europe. Who carved that point? What were they hoping to catch with it that particular week? Did it slip out of a cold wet hand by accident sliding into a river that would not become seabed for thousands of years yet? Or did somebody leave it there for a completely different reason? Some archaeologists lean towards simple bad luck. One tool lost during an ordinary hunt, a small forgettable moment among thousands across an entire lifetime. Others point to a pattern seen at other sites from this same period across northern Europe, where tools and weapons appear to have been placed into rivers and wetlands on purpose, maybe as some kind of offering, maybe as part of a ritual whose meaning slipped away from us a very long time ago. Maybe it really was an accident. Maybe it was left there on purpose for reasons that made complete sense to the person holding it. Or, and this is the quietest possibility of all, maybe we will simply never know, and the true story of that one afternoon disappeared just as completely as the land it happened on. Picture it for a moment because it helps to picture it clearly. A wide green plain laced with slow-moving rivers, reed beds and rolling hills. Herds of deer and wild cattle drifting across it in the early morning mist. The smell of wood smoke sitting low against damp grass. Birds lifting off the marsh in loud, scattered waves whenever something moves too close. A thin line of smoke rising from a hearth tucked against the shelter of a low ground. A hunter crouched at the water's edge, running a thumb along a freshly cut barb, testing its edge, thinking about tomorrow, and nothing further than that. Not one person living on that land had any real reason to doubt it would simply continue. Their descendants, generation after generation, would surely go on living across that same soft, familiar ground. They were wrong, though, through no fault of their own. Their world was already being erased, not all at once, but steadily, year by year, as ice sheets around the planet kept melting into the sea, and the water kept climbing quietly up every river and every low field. Within a few thousand years, all of it would sit under the same cold, indifferent water that little steam trawler rocked on gently in the middle of an ordinary night's work. Decades later, researchers piecing together finds just like that harpoon point would finally give this vanished country a name of its own. In the late 1990s, an archaeologist at the University of Exeter named Bryony Coles named it Doggerland after Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank nearby once used by Dutch fishing boats called doggers. If your eyes are already starting to feel heavy, that is more than fine. That is honestly the entire point of being here tonight. Let yourself sink a little further into wherever you happen to be curled up right now. There is nothing here you need to remember, nothing to study, know where you need to be. Just let the pictures settle in on their own at their own pace. For a long time, even people who knew Doggerland had existed pictured it as some thin, forgettable strip of coastline barely worth imagining in any real detail. That picture turned out to be wrong too, and by quite a lot. In the early 2000s, oil and gas companies working across the North Sea had already spent years bouncing sound waves off the ocean floor, mapping every ridge and valley buried deep under the mud, hunting for pockets of fuel trapped in ancient rock. None of that effort had anything to do with archaeology. But when a team at the University of Birmingham, led by a landscape archaeologist named Vincent Gaffney, along with a graduate student named Simon Fitch, finally got a proper look at that data, they realised they were sitting on top of something extraordinary, hidden inside a survey built for a completely different purpose. Buried under the modern seabed were the unmistakable outlines of ancient river valleys, lake basins and rolling hills stretching across a landscape that would eventually add up to nearly 18,000 square miles, an area larger than the entire country of the Netherlands. Among the very first shapes to appear clearly on their screens was a wide, winding river valley, cutting straight across what is now empty ocean. They would later name it after a geologist who had spent his career studying the region. The Schotten River, a waterway that has been dry for thousands of years, buried now under sediment and sea, yet traced out in almost perfect detail by machines built only to search for oil. Here's what's remarkable about that. Technology built purely to find fuel underneath the seafloor ended up finding an entire vanished country. Instead, one that had been quietly erased from every map, every memory, every story for thousands of years. Nobody can say with any real certainty exactly how many people called that land home at its richest point. Some researchers picture small scattered bands moving with the seasons, following the herds across open ground. Others argue that a place this rich with marshes full of fish and waterfowl rivers, thick with salmon forests full of deer, could easily have supported far larger, more settled communities than anyone first assumed. Maybe it was mostly quiet and empty, brushed by only a handful of wandering families each year. Maybe it was in its own way one of the richest places to live anywhere in Europe at the time. Or maybe the truth sits somewhere in between the two, shifting from one generation to the next. And we're only now, thousands of years later, catching the faintest outline of it in survey data that was never meant to find us at all. There is something quietly humbling in that thought. An entire country home to real people living real ordinary routines. Nobody thought to write down because nobody there had any writing yet at all. Simply slipped beneath the waves and out of memory completely. No name of it survived on its own. No single story survived. Only tools and bones and the outline of old rivers waiting patiently in the dark for anyone to eventually come looking. That single fishing trip in 1931 turned out to be only the beginning. Over the decades that followed, trawlers working that same stretch of water kept dragging up more and more evidence, the teeth of long-extinct mammoths, and in 1999 a fisherman even hauled up a nearly complete mammoth skull, along with the antlers of deer species that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. Stone tools, fragments of ancient forest still rooted exactly where they had grown. Slowly, piece by piece, an entire lost world came into focus at the bottom of the North Sea, and it forced a much bigger question onto the table. If a whole landscape complete with its own rivers, its own hills, its own hunters could disappear underwater within a handful of thousand years, what else changed just as fast in that same strange stretch of time when the last ice age finally came undone? That question is really what this whole journey's about tonight. Because Doggerland was never some rare isolated accident. It was one small piece of something far bigger, a period when the entire planet seemed to lose its grip on rules it had followed for more than 100,000 years. Giant animals that had walked the earth since long before any human eye ever watched them would vanish within a few thousand years, and we will sit with the honest argument over why. Farming something no group of people had ever needed before would suddenly take root in several places at once, almost as though the ground itself only allowed it for the first time. A single wave, taller than anything this coastline has seen since may have delivered the final blow to whatever was left of that lost land. And somewhere in the middle of all that upheaval, a rock may or may not have actually fallen out of the sky. But to understand how the world could change that fast, and how one ordinary fishing net off the English coast could reach straight into a drowned world thousands of years old, we have to step back even further than that little boat, and even further than the one carved point sitting quietly in a museum case today. We have to go back to a time before any of this had happened yet, A time when ice not water ruled almost everything you could find on a map. A time when ice not water ruled almost everything you could find on a map. So let's actually stand there for a moment, because most people picture that world completely wrong. Say the words Ice Age out loud and a certain image probably shows up without permission. A silent, frozen nothing, grey and empty, a world with the life switched off something closer to the surface of the moon than an actual breathing place. Forget that picture. Set it down somewhere and leave it there, because the truth was almost the exact opposite. Roughly 15,000 years ago, on a wide stretch of open grassland in what is now central Ukraine, a small group of hunters is putting the finishing touches on a house. There is no timber here to build with. Trees simply cannot survive this far out on the open plain, not in this cold, not in this much open, gusting air. So they are building with what the land actually provides in enormous supply bone. Mammoth bone, mostly along with a fair share of tusk. Skulls stacked like foundation stones. Long leg bones set upright and angled inward, tusks curved overhead to form a kind of ribbed arching roof. Hides stretched tight across the gaps to hold in the warmth of a fire pit dug at the very centre. Think for a second about the sheer physical effort sitting inside a project like that. Some of those leg bones alone weigh as much as a grown adult. There is no cart here, no domesticated animal to haul weight. Nothing but human shoulders and rope made from twisted hide dragging skeleton after skeleton across open ground and lifting each piece into place by hand. Whoever organised a build like this was not simply looking for shelter for one cold night. They were investing in something meant to stand through an entire brutal season, maybe several. Here's a number worth sitting with for a second. One structure like this could use bones pulled from dozens of different mammoths animals that stood taller than the people building around their remains. And this was not one lonely house standing by itself out on the steppe. Archaeologists would eventually count 4 separate dwellings clustered together at this one site, built from a combined total of 149 mammoth bones. A tiny working neighbourhood made almost entirely out of skeletons. Inside one of those houses tonight, somebody is almost certainly repairing a torn hide with a bone needle, working by firelight, while gusts of cold air rattle against the tusks overhead. Somebody else is probably resharpening a spear point or turning strips of dried meat over the coals. It would have smelled of smoke and fat and damp fur, and it would have been, by every account we can piece together, warm enough inside to strip down to almost nothing, even while the ground outside sat frozen solid for months at a stretch. Now that alone tends to reshape the picture people carry around of an entire era. But here is the deeper reversal hiding underneath it. This landscape these hunters were living on, the one stretching in every direction around their bone houses, was not some marginal half-dead fringe of the world. It had a name one modern scientist would eventually give it: the Mammoth Steppe. And by some calculations, comparing the sheer weight of animal life it carried per square mile, this cold, dry grassland supported roughly as much large wildlife as the African Serengeti does today. Say that back to yourself for a moment, because it deserves to sit there uncomfortably. The picture in your head of the Ice Age is probably silence and stillness. The reality was herds. Enormous thundering herds of bison and wild horses and woolly rhinoceros moving across grassland that ran with barely a gap from what is now Spain, clear across Europe over Siberia, across a vanished stretch of land bridging Asia to North America, and down into the Yukon. One single continuous cold windswept ocean of grass, wrapping most of the way around the top of the entire planet. Stand on any low-rise out on that steppe at the right moment, and the ground itself would have carried the sound before your ears ever caught it. A low, steady tremor rolling up through your boots as thousands of hooves crossed open country somewhere just past the horizon. It is not the picture most textbooks hand you. Cold, yes. Difficult, absolutely. But quiet was never really part of it. Here's a question worth sitting with if you're comfortable enough to let your mind wander for a moment. Do you know roughly where you are tonight in relation to all of this? because there is a decent chance the ground under your own house sat either buried under solid ice or standing right at its ragged, crumbling southern edge. If you're listening from somewhere near New York or Chicago, or across a wide stretch of northern Europe, the ice sheet's true edge likely sat only a short drive from where you're lying right now. A little further south, and you would have been standing on that same rich wind-blown grassland instead, near enough to hear the herds passing, and that ice itself deserves its own moment of scale, at its thickest in places like modern Scandinavia and the region around Hudson Bay in Canada. This ice sat nearly 2 miles deep, burying entire mountain ranges the way a blanket buries a sleeping shape on a bed. Altogether, ice like this covered somewhere around a quarter of all the dry land on Earth, and because every bit of that frozen water had been pulled directly out of the ocean's sea level across the entire planet, sat somewhere between 120 and 130 meters lower than it does tonight. An entire extra layer of coastline stretching out from every continent, simply standing there in open air instead of underwater. Two of these frozen giants deserve their own names, since between the two of them they shaped almost everything else in this story. Across North America sat the Laurentide Sheet, a slab of ice thick enough to bury the Great Lakes completely, and stretch southward past where Chicago and New York now stand, reaching down toward the Ohio River Valley. Across northern Europe sat its cousin the Scandinavian Sheet, spreading out from Norway and Sweden to cover the Baltic and press down into what is now Germany and the Netherlands. Between the two of them, an area roughly equal to all of North America was simply gone under ice, replaced by a flat, featureless, glowing white horizon in every direction. This is the very same drop, by the way, that once let a hunter walk dry-footed across land that is now called the North Sea, carrying a barbed antler point that a fishing boat would not pull back into daylight for many thousands of years. The whole world everywhere was simply built differently back then, wider and more connected than the maps most of us grew up memorizing. Off toward the other side of the globe, an entire second world of exposed land sat waiting. To a vast stretch now called Sunderland, joining islands like Java, Sumatra and Borneo into one single sprawling landmass in Southeast Asia. We are not stepping into that story tonight, but it is worth knowing it is out there quietly waiting its turn. None of this, it is worth adding honestly, was one single uniform picture of grassy abundance stretching to every horizon. Push far enough into the interior of Siberia away from the richer river valleys, and the land turned drier and harsher, closer to true cold desert than lush grazing ground, with entire stretches where snow itself barely fell, because there was simply not enough moisture left in the air to make any. Survival on the Mammoth Steppe was not evenly generous. Some corners of it fed herds and hunters alike in real abundance. Other corners offered barely enough to scrape by on, and asked a great deal in return for very little. Staying alive out on ground like that took more than a sturdy bone house. Clothing had to be sewn, not simply draped fitted tightly enough at the wrists and ankles to keep out that constant biting air, stitched together with bone needles fine enough to pull sinew thread through hide without splitting it. Try for a moment to imagine sewing a coat where a loose stitch is not a fashion complaint, but an actual immediate risk to your life. Fires needed feeding with fat and dried dung as often as with wood, since wood itself was a genuine luxury out here. And the animals sharing this grassland with these hunters were not limited to the placid herds grazing across it. Cave lions patrolled the same open ground alongside packs of enormous wolves, and more rarely hyenas that had wandered up out of warmer country generations before. None of it was gentle, all of it somehow was survivable. There is even a quiet ongoing argument among researchers about exactly how a settlement like the one in Ukraine actually functioned. Some picture it as a true winter base occupied by the same extended family group for months at a stretch every single year, a fixed point people always returned to once the coldest weather arrived. Others argue the evidence points instead toward a site reused across many separate generations, rebuilt and repaired by different groups passing through the same convenient spot along the river decades or even centuries apart, rather than one continuous household living there without interruption. Maybe it really was one steady, unbroken home returned to winter after winter by the very same family line. Maybe it was more like a favourite campsite quietly passed down and rediscovered by strangers who never knew each other's names. Or maybe, honestly, both things happened there at different points centuries apart, and the bones themselves simply cannot tell us exactly where one story ends and the next one begins. So how many people were actually living through all of this spread out across that enormous stretch of cold and grass? Honestly, nobody can say with any real precision. Some researchers working from patterns hidden inside modern human genetics argue that the coldest stretch of this period squeezed human populations down into a small handful of scattered livable pockets, isolated survival grounds tucked into warmer valleys or sheltered coastlines, while the worst of the cold locked down everything around them. That idea even has a name among geneticists, a population bottleneck, a narrow neck in a bottle that almost everyone alive today can trace their ancestry back through. Other researchers push back on that picture, arguing that a landscape as rich as the Mammoth Steppe, thick with herds and fresh water, could easily have supported a much wider, better connected network of communities than a strict bottleneck story allows for. Maybe survival really did come down to a handful of fragile isolated pockets, holding on through the worst of it by pure luck and skill. Maybe the truth was closer to a loose, resilient web of communities stretched thin but never completely broken. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest answer of the three different parts of the world, we're doing both of those things at once, and we're still trying to stitch that full, complicated picture back together from scattered bone and stone. If your body already feels heavier against whatever you're resting on tonight, let it stay that way. There is nothing urgent in any of this. No dates to memorize, no test at the end. Just let the pictures keep drifting past on their own, at whatever pace feels comfortable. None of what we just walked through, by the way, was sitting neatly written down somewhere waiting patiently for someone to open a book and find it. Almost everything we know about that bone house in Ukraine only exists because of one very ordinary afternoon in 1965 when a local farmer digging out a bit more space for his cellar hit something hard and pale sitting in the dirt. It turned out to be the lower jawbone of a mammoth. He kept digging. More bone kept appearing. Eventually, archaeologists arrived and slowly, patiently pulled an entire vanished household back out of the ground, one bone at a time, 15,000 years after the last fire in its centre, hearth had gone cold. Tucked among the debris nearby, they even found a mammoth skull painted with a pattern of red dots, and a small fragment of tusk carved with lines that some researchers believe may be a crude map of the surrounding land, drawn by someone standing exactly where that farmer's cellar would one day sit. Pieces of that same bone house sit today inside museum halls a very long way from that Ukrainian field, including one in New York City where visitors on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon can stand and look through glass at a wall built from the remains of an animal that has not existed anywhere on Earth for thousands of years. A farmer's shovel in Ukraine, a trawler's net in the North Sea, two completely unrelated ordinary working days separated by decades and hundreds of miles, each one accidentally reaching backward into the same vanished world. It makes you wonder honestly how much more of that world is still sitting quietly under our feet right now, waiting for somebody's shovel or somebody's plough or somebody's fishing net to bump into it by pure accident. This then is the world sitting underneath everything else we're going to walk through together tonight. Not a dead frozen planet waiting quietly to be forgiven. A cold, loud, crowded one full of grass and bone and breath humming along in a rhythm it had already kept for nearly 100,000 years. As far as anyone living through it could have possibly known, there was no reason at all to expect that rhythm would ever change. The herds would keep moving. The bone houses would keep getting rebuilt season after season, family after family. The ice at the edge of the world would simply stay exactly where it had always been. But somewhere out in that cold, a very small, very specific piece of evidence was already quietly forming, one that scientists would not properly notice until long after both that farmer and that trawler crew had come and gone. Not in a bone, not in a tusk, in something far smaller, far quieter, and far easier to miss completely, a single delicate species of flower, pressed flat and preserved inside the mud at the bottom of a lake, waiting patiently for someone to finally understand what it had been trying to say the entire time. That someone, as it turns out, is a patient, slightly stubborn Swedish botanist, working alone in a clay pit in the southernmost tip of Sweden in the year 1870. His name was Alfred Nathorst, and what he was doing honestly does not sound like the beginning of anything important. He was crouched in cold, wet clay, sifting through it by hand, searching for tiny fragments of ancient plants pressed flat inside layers of freshwater sediment. Most days gave him almost nothing. By his own account, if he managed to pull out even one leaf he could actually identify, he counted that as a good day's work. One leaf. An entire day. It is easy to picture the kind of look a passing farmer might have given a grown man on his knees in a ditch, squinting at mud for hours, convinced that mud was trying to tell him something worth hearing. Here's what kept him coming back anyway. The leaves he did find again and again belonged to a small, low 8-petaled flower called Dryas octopetala, sometimes known as mountain avens, a plant that only grows today in truly harsh, cold, storm-scoured places up near the Arctic or high on exposed mountainsides. Finding it meant almost nothing on its own. Finding it pressed inside clay that sat layer after layer in a spot where warmer, gentler plants had clearly grown both before and after it meant something else entirely. Picture a sandwich and you will understand this discovery better than most textbooks manage to explain it. Down at the bottom of that clay pit, older layers held pollen and leaves from birch trees and other plants that only survive in a truly mild climate. Then sitting directly above that came a thinner, harder layer packed with cold-loving little Arctic plants, this same stubborn mountain flower chief among them. And then right above that, the birch and the gentler plants returned again as if nothing unusual had ever happened at all. Warm, then cold, then warm again, preserved in mud like a single frozen sentence written by the climate itself. That pattern should not have existed, at least not according to the story most scientists at the time assumed was true. Everyone pictured the retreat of the last ice age as one long, steady, uninterrupted climb, out of the cold, a slow staircase leading gently upward toward the world we know today. A sandwich like this one cold, pressed directly between two warm layers, meant the staircase had a step missing. Or worse, a step that led backward before it led forward again. It would take a few more decades and a pair of Danish geologists working near a town called Allerød to pin the full shape of that backward step down properly. Around 1901, Nikolai Hartz and Wilhelm Milters were studying a similar clay deposit, digging into the same patient, unglamorous work Nathorst had spent his career on, and found the exact same Arctic layer, sandwiched the exact same way, tucked between two warmer intervals. One of those warmer stretches even ended up lending its name to the whole region's climate history. The Allerød remembered today as a genuine, real warming, a false dawn that convinced an entire ecosystem the worst of the cold was finally behind it. It was not. Something colder returned right on the heels of that warmth, hard enough and fast enough to push Arctic tundra back across land that had only just begun growing forests again. Birch saplings that had taken root during those warmer centuries stood frozen and dying in soil that refused to soften again for well over 1,000 years. And because a similar, slightly older cold snap had already been noticed sitting even further down in the layers, this newer one needed a name to keep the two apart. Hart settled on calling it the younger Dryas, after the very same stubborn little flower Nathorst had been quietly digging out of clay decades earlier, mostly alone, mostly ignored one leaf at a time. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment if you have ever lived through one of those cruel early spring weeks where the snow melts, the air turns soft, you put your coat away a little too soon, and then winter simply slams back down out of nowhere, undoing weeks of hope in a single cold morning. Now imagine that same feeling stretched out across an entire continent, and lasting not for one miserable week, but for something nearer to 1200 years, because that is roughly the shape of what the Younger Dryas actually was. Best estimates place its start at somewhere around 12,900 years ago, arriving directly on top of a world that had already been warming steadily, and for real for well over 1,000 years beforehand. Forests that had been creeping northward into Scandinavia stalled out and reversed. Glaciers that had been quietly shrinking in the Alps and across northern Europe pushed forward again. Dust picked up from dry exposed ground in Central Asia began drifting all the way across the continent, thick enough to show up as its own distinct gritty layer inside lake sediments hundreds of miles away. How do we even know it lasted roughly 1200 years down to a reasonably confident number rather than some vague guess? Partly thanks to a small volcanic crater lake tucked into the Eifel region of Germany, one that happens to settle a fresh distinct layer of sediment onto its own floor every single year, season after season, the way a tree lays down a new ring. Cut down through that lake bed and you are not reading a rough estimate. You're counting actual individual years one at a time, stacked in order, like pages in a very patient, very muddy calendar. Researchers doing exactly that, layer by layer under a microscope, arrived at a Younger Dryas, lasting somewhere between roughly 1,000 and 1,150 years, a remarkably tight, sober number for an event this ancient and this dramatic. So what actually flipped that switch? What could reach across an entire hemisphere and shove a warming world back into the cold, hard enough to leave a scar sitting in the mud for scientists to find 9,000 years later? For a long stretch of the 20th century, one explanation dominated almost every serious conversation on the subject. It came from a geochemist named Wallace Broecker, working out of a research center just north of New York City called the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. A man who had already spent years mapping how heat moves through the world's oceans, and who more or less single-handedly gave the general public the very metaphor we still reach for today. Colleagues would later describe him as blunt restless, and thoroughly allergic to comfortable, settled explanations, the kind of scientist who seemed happiest when he was quietly rearranging everyone else's assumptions. Broecker's answer involved a lake most people have never heard of, an absolutely enormous body of glacial meltwater called Lake Agassiz, pooling up behind the retreating edge of the ice sheet, across what is now the American Midwest and the Canadian prairies. At its largest, this lake held more fresh water than every one of today's Great Lakes combined, spilling across a stretch of land wider than several modern American states put together. A lake so large it does not even properly exist anymore, only its old dry shorelines still faintly visible from the air, today traced out across farmland in Minnesota and North Dakota and Manitoba, like the ghost of a coastline nobody currently living has ever actually seen underwater. Broecker's idea, laid out in 1989, was that this lake's overflow suddenly changed course, pouring a staggering volume of fresh cold water into the North Atlantic Ocean, instead of draining quietly south toward the Gulf of Mexico as it had been doing before. And that shift, according to his hypothesis, was enough to break something enormous. Stay with this for a second, because it is worth understanding properly rather than just nodding along. The North Atlantic normally works like a conveyor belt. Warm, salty water flows north from the tropics, loses its heat into the air over Europe along the way, then grows cold and dense enough to sink, dragging the whole cycle back round again. Salt is the key ingredient holding that whole engine together, because salty water is heavy enough to sink properly, The same basic reason a spoonful of salt settles toward the bottom of a glass of water rather than staying suspended near the top. Flood that same stretch of ocean with an enormous volume of fresh light meltwater all at once, and the salty water underneath can no longer sink the way it needs to. The conveyor belt stutters. In the worst version of this story, it stops turning almost completely. Shut that circulation down even briefly, and Europe loses an enormous steady supply of ocean-carried heat it had been quietly relying on for thousands of years, without anyone ever having to think about it. The younger Dryas in this telling was not really about ice advancing so much as it was about warmth suddenly being cut off at the source, the way a house goes cold the moment somebody switches off the furnace in the middle of winter. For a long time, this explanation held up beautifully. Then a few decades later, other researchers went looking for physical proof that Lake Agassiz's floodwater had actually travelled the route Breuker originally proposed down through the Great Lakes and out along the St. Lawrence Valley. They struggled to find it. The kind of dramatic, scoured, flood-carved landscape you would expect from a lake that size bursting through that particular route simply was not sitting there waiting to be discovered. So the story shifted the way good science tends to when the evidence pushes back. A newer analysis proposed the floodwater more likely escaped through a completely different corridor, entirely running northwest along what is now the valley of the Mackenzie River, out into the Arctic Ocean instead, before working its way around into the North Atlantic from there. Same lake, same general idea, a completely different route to get there. Maybe Breuker's original path was closer to correct than the newer route suggests. Maybe the Mackenzie corridor really was the one true doorway that meltwater found. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest way to leave it sitting tonight, the truth turns out to involve several routes working together at different moments in ways the mud and gravel left behind still has not finished explaining to us. It is worth pausing on one more thing before we move past this particular ocean current, because it tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. That same conveyor belt Breuker spent his career mapping is still running today, still carrying warmth up toward Europe from the tropics, and researchers keeping watch on it in recent years have measured it slowing down a little compared to earlier decades. Nobody serious is suggesting a repeat of a 1200-year deep freeze is waiting around the corner. The volumes of fresh water involved today are nowhere near what an entire collapsing ice sheet could pour into the ocean at once. But it is a strange thing sitting with a mechanism first uncovered by one man patiently counting leaves in the mud and realizing scientists are still quietly checking its pulse more than a century later. If you notice your own attention drifting a little right about now, let it drift. This part of the story rewards a wandering mind more than a sharp one. Picture the mud, the cold, the single patient man on his knees in it, and let your own eyelids borrow a little of that same patience. None of this needs to be followed perfectly, to still land somewhere pleasant in your mind. Let your shoulders drop an inch or two if they have not already. There is something almost tender about how this entire chapter of Earth's history got found in the first place. Not a fishing net hauling something enormous out of the sea, not a farmer's shovel striking bone underground, just one patient man in cold mud pulling out a single small leaf on a good day, convinced it meant something decades before anyone else agreed with him. Small evidence, enormous consequence. That pattern, it turns out, keeps showing up again and again in this story, and it is going to show up again before tonight is finished. There is a small lesson tucked inside that fact if you're willing to sit with it for a moment. We tend to picture climate as something slow, something that only shifts across the span of many careless lifetimes, safely out of reach of anyone alive to actually notice it happening. The younger Dryas argues otherwise. It suggests the system holding an entire planet's temperature roughly steady behaves less like a dial. Someone turns gradually, and more like a held breath capable of letting go all at once if the right piece gets nudged loose. That is not the most comforting thought to end an evening on. It might all the same be an honest one. Whatever the exact plumbing turns out to have been, one thing about the Younger Dryas remains uncontested, and it deserves to sit with you for a moment before we move any further. A world that had already convinced itself the worst of the cold was over, got proven wrong hard and without warning. Forests that had crept hopefully northward were pushed back into tundra. Families following herds across newly green ground, the very same herds we spent time with earlier tonight, watched that ground harden and empty out again within a single lifetime. Children born into what looked like an easier world grew old inside a harder one without ever fully understanding why the weather itself seemed to have turned against them. And whatever exactly triggered that reversal, one particular piece of it remains stranger and far more disputed than a lake full of meltwater alone can fully account for. A handful of scientists looking at the very same layer of ash and clay that Hartz and Nathorst once dug through by hand believe something else arrived in that same narrow window of time. Something that did not originate on this planet at all, and something that most of their own colleagues, for reasons that will make a great deal of sense once you hear the evidence, have spent nearly 2 decades arguing about. Nearly 2 decades of arguing, and it all traces back to a low quiet mound of earth sitting beside a lake in northern Syria, a lake that as it happens should not even be there. The mound is called Abu Huraira, and before the lake existed, before a dam went up across the Euphrates River back in the 1970s and swallowed the whole valley underwater, archaeologists had already spent years carefully peeling back its layers. What they found made the site famous long before anyone thought to connect it to anything falling from space. Houses built from mud, brick and reed clustered tightly together along a low rise above the floodplain. Grinding stones worn smooth from years of steady, patient use. Charred seeds, thousands of them carefully sorted by botanists decades later, seed by seed, to work out exactly which wild grasses these particular people were gathering and in what season, and how their habits slowly shifted over the centuries they lived there. Abu Huraira held some of the earliest direct evidence anywhere on Earth of people beginning to tend and gather wild grains on purpose. Right at the edge of the very transition this whole story is slowly working its way toward. None of that on its own is what pulled Abu Huraira into this particular argument. Buried inside one very specific layer of soil dated to right around 12,800 years ago, cutting straight across the floor of one of these very houses, researchers kept turning up something odd. Tiny beads and smears of glass scattered through the sediment, the kind of material you would expect from a kiln or a furnace, or some sort of industrial process that simply did not exist anywhere on Earth at that point in human history. When a team eventually studied that glass, properly checking exactly how hot something would need to get to melt sand and soil into that particular shape, the numbers stopped making any sense at all for an ordinary village fire. Some of it pointed to temperatures above 2,200 degrees Celsius. For comparison, a cooking fire inside a reed and mud hut tops out somewhere around 11 or 1,200 degrees. Whatever melted that soil at Abu Huraira was burning at roughly double the heat of anything a household hearth could ever produce. And testing ruled out a lightning strike too, since the glass simply did not carry the magnetic signature. Lightning tends to leave behind. So what does that leave? A fire hot enough to outdo any hearth by nearly double, with no lightning strike anywhere near the scene, sitting inside the debris of an ordinary early farming settlement that, as far as anyone can tell, had absolutely nothing to do with metalworking, kiln firing, or any other human technology capable of reaching those kinds of temperatures at that point in history. This is where the story widens out considerably, because Abu Huraira turns out to be only one small piece of something researchers had already been arguing about for over a decade by that point. Back in 2007, a scientist named Richard Firestone, working alongside a fairly large team of collaborators, laid out a truly startling proposal. They argued that something struck, or more precisely exploded above the Earth, roughly 12,800 years ago, right at the very start of the Younger Dryas, scattering debris across an enormous stretch of the planet in the process. Not one single tidy crater somewhere convenient. Their proposal involved a disintegrating comet breaking apart before it ever reached the ground, showering fragments and airborne blasts of heat across sites on at least 4 separate continents. Here's the case they built piece by piece, at dozens of sites scattered from North America to Europe to the Middle East. A thin, distinct carbon-rich layer of soil, sometimes nicknamed the black mat, kept turning up right at that same narrow slice of time. Inside it, platinum in concentrations far higher than anything ordinarily found in soil. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first. Platinum is truly rare in the dirt and rock sitting near Earth's own surface, since most of the planet's original supply sank down into the core billions of years ago, while everything was still molten. Space rocks never went through that process, so many of them still carry platinum in comparatively generous amounts. Finding an unexplained spike of it in a thin layer of ancient soil is a little like finding a rare foreign coin scattered across dozens of separate backyards on the same afternoon all at once, with no explanation for how it got there locally. Alongside the platinum sat microscopic diamonds tiny enough that you would need serious laboratory equipment to ever notice them, the sort that tend to form under exactly the kind of violent pressure a cosmic impact can generate. Tiny magnetic spherules round little metallic beads consistent with molten rock cooling almost instantly in mid-air, and soot in enormous quantities hinting at wildfires that may have burned across a scale most of us would struggle to properly picture. Try for a second to imagine standing somewhere out on that landscape and looking up to see something in the sky that has no name yet nothing in your entire understanding of the world to compare it to. No word for comet, no word for asteroid, just an impossible light and then heat and then a version of the world that does not look anything like the one you fell asleep in. It helps honestly to borrow a more recent comparison one with actual witnesses and photographs attached to it. In 1908, a rocky fragment exploded in the air above a remote stretch of Siberia near a river called the Tunguska. Nothing struck the ground directly. No crater ever turned up, not then, not since. And yet that single airburst flattened somewhere around 80 million trees across roughly 800 square miles of forest, snapping trunks like matchsticks in a pattern that still radiates outward from the blast point when you look at it from above. If a fragment that size exploding in open air over empty wilderness could level a forest that large in a matter of seconds, then a much bigger swarm of fragments breaking apart above a far more widely inhabited world 12,800 years ago starts to look a great deal less far-fetched than it might have sounded a moment ago. If your body wants to settle a little deeper into the blankets right about now, go ahead and let it. This particular scientific argument has been running for nearly 20 years, without any sign of stopping, so it is certainly not going to resolve itself in the next few minutes, and it does not need your full attention to keep circling quietly along in the background, while your mind starts to drift somewhere softer. Naturally, a claim this large did not sail through unchallenged, and honestly it should not have. That is not scientists being difficult for the sake of it. It is exactly how the whole system is supposed to work. Other laboratories trying to reproduce the original findings at some of the very same sites kept running into trouble. Teams working independently searched for those same tiny diamonds and those same magnetic spherules, and in several cases simply could not find them in anywhere near the quantities the original study reported. One research group spent months carefully sampling supposedly matching layers at several North American sites, and came back largely empty-handed, a result that in scientific circles tends to carry almost as much weight as a positive finding does. Critics pointed out that several of the supposed impact markers, various forms of carbon among them, can form through completely ordinary, entirely earthly processes, wildfires and algae blooms among them, and are not on their own reliable proof that anything fell from space at all. Timing became its own separate headache. When researchers carefully dated the layer at different sites around the world, the ages did not always line up as neatly as a single simultaneous planet-wide event would demand, with gaps stretching up to roughly 2 centuries between locations that were supposed to represent the exact same afternoon. By around 2011, one particularly pointed scientific paper went about as far as a paper can go in declaring an idea finished walking through the case point by point, criticism by criticism, and essentially delivering a formal, thoroughly documented obituary for the whole hypothesis. Reading it, you get the distinct sense the authors believed they were closing a chapter, for good, tidying up a colourful but ultimately mistaken detour in the field's history and setting it gently aside. And then, rather inconveniently for that obituary, the story refused to stay buried. New excavations kept surfacing fresh material worth arguing over. Ice-penetrating radar aimed at a remote stretch of Greenland's ice sheet turned up something startling in 2018. A large, strikingly fresh-looking impact crater sitting underneath a glacier, wider than many modern cities hidden from view, for who knows how long its precise age still not settled with real confidence. Some researchers studying it lean toward an age that lines up with this exact window of time. Others argue it could easily be tens of thousands of years older, an entirely unrelated scar left by an entirely unrelated visitor from space. The ice above it simply has not given up a confident enough answer yet, and everyone studying it seems to know better than to force one. Then came that careful high-temperature analysis of the glass at Abu Huraira, adding one specific, well-documented, thoroughly modern human settlement to a debate that had mostly lived inside abstract layers of ancient dirt up to that point. By the early 2020s, a fresh, wide-ranging review of the accumulated evidence argued that the core physical case real platinum spikes, real melted rock showing up consistently at site after site deserved to be taken seriously by the wider scientific community. After all, whatever a single obituary from a decade earlier had claimed. Here's the honest, slightly frustrating shape of where this argument actually stands tonight, and it deserves better than a tidy ribbon tied around it. That something struck or exploded somewhere above this planet around 12,800 years ago now carries real, if still incomplete, physical support behind it. Whether that event actually triggered the younger Dryas cooling itself, whether it played any meaningful role in the extinction of the giant animals we will spend real time with soon, whether it disrupted entire human cultures, living across whole continents at once, remains a far shakier, far more contested claim, one that even researchers sympathetic to the impact evidence itself are careful not to overstate. Maybe a real impact happened and truly reshaped the climate and the animals and the people living through it all at once in one terrible season. Nobody left behind a single word to describe. Maybe something real did fall from the sky around that time, brief and violent and locally devastating, without actually being large enough to tip an entire hemisphere into over 1,000 years of cold on its own. Or maybe, and this is the answer that keeps the argument alive at academic conferences to this very day, we simply do not have enough sites dated precisely enough to know for certain which of those two stories is closer to true. If your eyelids have started drooping somewhere in the middle of all that scientific back and forth, that is a perfectly reasonable place for them to be. None of these researchers expect you to hold every detail of platinum and melted quartz in your head to still fall asleep peacefully tonight. Let the argument fade into background noise if it wants to. There is something almost funny in a very quiet, very academic sort of way about how much of a scientist's entire career can end up riding on, whether a speck of dust under a microscope counts as a real diamond or merely looks like one. Careers built and occasionally unmade over particles too small to see without expensive machinery, argued over in journals most of us will never open by people who have devoted decades to a single layer of ancient dirt most of humanity will walk past without a second glance. Somewhere out there tonight in a windowless laboratory, Lit by the pale glow of a microscope screen, somebody is almost certainly still counting them. There is also something worth sitting with a little more seriously before we move past this. Whatever actually happened in that narrow window of time, an early human settlement in what is now Syria, a place where people were already learning to coax food out of soil on purpose, rather than only gathering what grew wild left behind completely by accident, physical proof of one of the strangest and most violent moments in its own short history. Nobody there wrote it down. Nobody left a name for whatever passed overhead that day. All that survived is glass and platinum and a temperature reading so extreme it embarrassed every conventional explanation anyone tried to offer first. It is worth remembering too that whoever lived through that particular season at Abu Huraira almost certainly had no idea their ordinary lives would ever matter to anyone again. They were not building monuments. They were not recording history for strangers thousands of years in the future. They were simply grinding grain, raising families, repairing roofs, living inside the small, specific, unremarkable texture of one particular life, right up until something enormous and unexplained rewrote the sky above their heads. That is, if you sit with it long enough, a strange kind of comfort as much as a warning. Ordinary life, it turns out, is exactly the kind of thing worth leaving evidence of, even by accident, even without meaning to. Whatever caused it, meltwater alone, a comet fragment, or perhaps some combination, neither hypothesis fully captures on its own. The Younger Dryas eventually had to end the same way. Every stretch of deep cold eventually does sooner or later, one way or another. What almost nobody expects the first time they hear the real details laid out properly is exactly how fast that ending actually turned out to be, or how completely it would rewrite everything the ice sheets, the sea levels, and the animals of that entire vanished world had settled into. Exactly how fast it turns out is a number that took scientists standing on top of nearly 2 miles of solid ice to finally pin down. Picture the flattest, whitest, most featureless place you can imagine stretching out in every direction, until it simply meets the sky somewhere near the exact center of Greenland. No trees, no rivers, nothing at all breaks the horizon. In the late 1980s and on into the early 90s, 2 separate research teams, one largely American, one largely made up of scientists from across Europe, set up camp only a short distance apart from each other out on that empty white plain and started drilling straight down. That short distance between the 2 camps was not an accident. It was in its own quiet way one of the most useful decisions either team made. Drilling 2 separate, fully independent cores near enough together to represent the exact same climate history, but far enough apart that neither team could simply be looking at each other's mistakes, meant that whatever each drill eventually pulled up could be checked directly against the other. When both records gathered by different people using slightly different equipment, funded by entirely different governments, came back showing the same abrupt cliff, sitting at the exact same depth, that agreement carried far more weight than either core could have managed sitting on its own. They were not looking for oil or gold or anything buried in rock. They were after the ice itself, and more specifically what the ice had been quietly recording one snowfall at a time, for longer than anyone had ever managed to decode clearly before. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it explained properly. Snow falling on central Greenland almost never fully melts. It simply keeps piling up year after year, century after century, each new snowfall pressing the layer beneath it, down a little further, slowly turning to dense solid ice under its own accumulated weight. Cut a long cylinder straight down through that stack, and you are not looking at a shapeless block. You are looking at something closer to the world's most patient tree, with each thin band representing one single year of snowfall layered on top of the last all the way down. The 2 teams drilling that winter were not stopping at some shallow symbolic depth either. Their drills eventually reached down through more than 2 miles of solid ice pulling up a continuous unbroken record stretching back over 100,000 years longer than modern humans had even been writing anything down at all. Try sitting with that scale for a second, because it deserves more than a passing nod. 100,000 years of individual winters stacked directly on top of each other, waiting patiently under a couple of research tents and some very cold, very determined scientists. If your own body is starting to feel pleasantly heavy right about now, let it sink. There is a particular kind of stillness in picturing that flat, white, silent landscape. Nothing moving for miles, nothing waiting to happen except the next careful turn of a drill. Borrow a little of that stillness for yourself, and ice like this does not just tell you when a given year happened. Trapped inside each layer are tiny bubbles of actual, honest-to-goodness ancient air, sealed away the moment that particular snow compacted into ice, untouched by anything since. The clever part, the piece that actually unlocks the temperature itself, traces back to a Danish scientist named Willy Dansgaard, and to a discovery that started almost unbelievably with a beer bottle in his own back garden. Back in the early 1950s, Dansgaard set an empty bottle outside during a passing rainstorm, purely out of curiosity, and later ran the rainwater he'd collected through a mass spectrometer, a piece of laboratory equipment built to measure the exact weight of individual molecules. What he noticed was a subtle but consistent pattern. Water molecules containing a very slightly heavier form of oxygen behave just a touch differently as clouds cool and rain falls, and the balance between that heavier oxygen and its more common lighter cousin shifts in a fairly predictable way, depending on the temperature of the air the moment that particular raindrop or snowflake actually formed. A backyard curiosity turned into an entire scientific discipline. Once Dansgaard confirmed that same subtle ratio was preserved just as reliably inside ancient snow compacted into ice, he had almost by accident built the world a genuine thermometer that could reach backward across 100,000 winters. Between the trapped air and that same isotope signature, a properly interpreted ice core does not just describe the ancient climate in vague general terms. It hands you something closer to a day-by-day weather report from tens of thousands of years ago, with an error margin, once the counting is done carefully, of only around 1%. So when these two teams counted their way down through the layers and reached the exact point marking the end of the Younger Dryas, what they found did not look anything like the slow, gentle curve most people would assume a climate has to follow, warming or cooling one way or the other. It looked more like a cliff, not a hill you could stroll down gradually, watching the scenery slowly change with every step. A cliff. One single layer of ice sitting directly on top of another, and between those two thin, physically touching bands of frozen snow, an entire hemisphere had apparently stopped behaving like the deep of an ice age and started behaving like something recognizably near the world outside your own window tonight. A glaciologist named Richard Alley, working with the American team, ended up becoming one of the clearest voices explaining exactly what that cliff meant, eventually writing an entire book about it that took its name directly from the ice core itself, calling it a kind of time machine, one that happened to be roughly 2 miles long. According to his analysis, and confirmed since by several other independent research groups, using slightly different methods, the temperature over central Greenland jumped by somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, and some estimates push that figure even higher, with the bulk of that warming crammed into a handful of decades at most. Some readings of the very same ice suggest the sharpest part of that jump might have unfolded in less time than that, possibly within something closer to a single decade. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment if you're still awake enough to do a little quiet math in your head. Think about the span of roughly 10 years, not a lifetime, not even half of one. The length of time it takes a child to become a teenager, or a young sapling to grow tall enough to cast real shade, or a mortgage payment to feel routine instead of frightening. Now imagine an entire hemisphere's climate sliding out of a deep freeze and into something resembling the modern world within that exact same stretch of time. That is more or less the shape of what the ice was quietly recording the entire time, waiting for someone patient enough and cold enough to come and interpret it properly. The ice offered up a second clue too, one that turned out to be just as telling as the temperature swing itself. Snow accumulation, meaning simply how much snow was falling and piling up on the ice sheet each year, roughly doubled at almost exactly the same moment the temperature jumped, based on measurements of how thick each individual annual layer sat, compared to the ones just below it. A layer of snow that might have measured only a few inches thick one winter could suddenly be sitting under a layer nearly twice that depth, only a handful of winters later. That detail matters more than it might sound like at first. Warmer air can hold and carry far more moisture than cold air can the same basic principle that explains why a humid summer afternoon feels so much heavier than a dry winter one. A sudden jump in snowfall arriving practically overnight in geological terms is not just a side note sitting next to the temperature story. It is a second, completely independent confirmation of the very same event recorded in an entirely different way inside the exact same block of ice. This is roughly the same conveyor belt of ocean circulation we spent time with earlier tonight, the one that may have stumbled and stalled when a flood of fresh meltwater diluted the salty water it depends on to keep sinking and turning. If that same circulation eventually found its footing again, restarting the way a stalled engine sometimes catches all at once, rather than easing gradually back to life, it would help explain why the recovery arrived with almost as much violence as the original collapse. Nature in this particular telling does not appear to have eased its way back out of the cold so much as it snapped back into place. If you're starting to feel your own thoughts drifting apart a little at the edges, let them. There will be no test on decades and degrees later tonight. Let the numbers blur softly together and picture the ice instead. Quiet and endless, patiently keeping score of a story nobody was around to write down any other way. There is something worth sitting with here beyond the raw numbers themselves. A shift like this did not stay locked away inside a research paper or a laboratory. Somewhere out on that transformed landscape, actual families were living through it in real time without graphs or ice cores or any way of knowing whether the strange new mildness in the air was a passing trick of the season or something that might actually hold. A person could plausibly have been born into the tail end of that brutal locked-in cold, spent their childhood hunting across frozen storm-scoured ground, and lived long enough to watch that same ground soften green over and fill with returning herds all within a single ordinary human life. Ask yourself honestly how you would explain a change like that to somebody younger than you with no science to reach for at all, only the plain strange fact of having lived through it yourself and having no real way to prove it wasn't simply a story you were telling. It is worth being honest about one more layer of nuance here too, since the story deserves better than an oversimplified headline. That striking figure somewhere around 5 to 10 degrees of warming in a matter of decades comes most clearly and most confidently from central Greenland itself, the single spot on the planet where the ice happened to preserve the clearest, most continuous record available. Other regions almost certainly felt this shift differently, some faster, some slower, some more muted, depending on how directly they sat in the path of that same disrupted ocean current. Sediment cores pulled from lake bottoms further south, sitting far from the immediate reach of the North Atlantic, tend to show a real warming trend too, but stretched out over a somewhat gentler curve than the sharp cliff sitting inside the Greenland ice. The honest picture is not one single uniform light switch flipping across the entire globe in perfect unison. It is closer to a very fast, very real change radiating outward from the North Atlantic, its exact speed and intensity shifting depending on how far away you happen to be standing. There is a particular kind of dedication worth pausing on for a moment, with something near real admiration in a group of scientists choosing to spend entire winters camped out on the most isolated, featureless stretch of ice on the planet, hauling up cylinder after cylinder of frozen history by hand, mostly for the quiet reward of understanding a single number a little more precisely. It is hard to think of many other jobs where the primary occupational hazard is simply the cold itself, and where a truly good day at the office means pulling up another few feet of an extremely old, extremely patient popsicle. Somewhere in a supply tent out on that ice, there was almost certainly a running argument about whose turn it was to melt snow for coffee, because even scientists chasing 100,000-year-old climate records still have to solve the exact same small, ordinary problems the rest of us do. Maybe the true speed of that warming sits closer to the gentler end of that 5 to 10 degree range spread across several careful decades rather than one violent handful of years. Maybe it really did happen closer to that harsher, faster end, a genuine climatic cliff rather than a steep hill. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave it resting tonight, the ice itself is telling us both of those readings are true in different ways depending on exactly which few centimeters of ancient snow you happen to be measuring and exactly which question you are patient enough to ask of it. Whatever the precise shape of that curve turned out to be, one consequence of it was every bit as real as the number itself, and considerably harder to measure with any instrument at all. All that newly freed water released as ice sheets that had ruled the planet for 100,000 years finally began losing their long patient grip for good had to go somewhere. There is something almost moving about that thought, honestly. The very ice that had spent 100,000 winters keeping this entire story a secret layer by patient layer was in that same abrupt decade or two quietly rewriting the map of the whole world it had been sitting on top of the entire time, and where that water went next would end up swallowing entire land masses whole, cutting off routes between continents that people had been walking freely for thousands of years, long before anyone standing on either side had any reason to expect the ground beneath their feet might simply stop being there. Some of them would watch it happen slowly enough to notice. Others would only realize generations later that the world on the far side of the water had quietly become a place their own grandparents could still remember reaching on foot. Some of them would watch it happen slowly enough to notice, and some of them would not, and that difference alone shaped two entirely separate stories on opposite sides of the planet. Start with a word that has been quietly misleading people for a very long time. Bridge. Say it. And most minds picture something narrow, something you cross in an afternoon, a strip of rock connecting one side of a canyon to the other. That word attached itself early to the strip of land once joining Siberia to Alaska, and it has been doing a small disservice to the truth ever since. What sat between those two coastlines during the depths of the Ice Age was not a bridge in any sense a hiking trail would recognize. It was a country. Depending on exactly where sea level happened to sit at a given moment, this land stretched nearly 1,000 miles from north to south, wide enough to swallow entire modern nations inside its borders, and it stayed above water for somewhere on the order of 10,000 years or more before the ocean finally reclaimed it. Researchers eventually gave this vanished landmass its own proper name, Berindia, and the closer people looked, the less it resembled the frozen, featureless crossing most textbooks used to imply. Sediment pulled from underneath the modern strait shows patches of shrub tundra, low birch and willow scattered across the open ground, enough scattered wood to keep a fire burning through a hard winter, along with grazing animals wandering a landscape that, weather permitting, could actually support people living there for real, not merely passing through on their way to somewhere else. One researcher who spent years piecing this picture together, an archaeologist named John Hoffaker, argued that this particular strip of shrub tundra likely functioned as a genuine refuge sheltered on three sides by ice and open water, exactly the kind of quietly livable pocket a population could settle into for generation after generation without ever needing to move on. He also suspected that wood itself, or the lack of it, may have quietly drawn the borders of where people actually could and could not settle, since a family without fuel for a fire on that particular stretch of ground was a family with a distinctly short future ahead of it, And here's where the story takes its first truly surprising turn, because the strongest evidence for what actually happened out on that vanished land did not come from digging in the dirt at all. It came from something considerably harder to flood: blood. Or more precisely, the DNA quietly riding along inside it, carried by millions of people alive today who have likely never given Beringia a single thought. Back in 1997, a pair of geneticists working in Latin America noticed something curious buried inside the genetic patterns of Native American populations. The particular set of mutations they were tracking looked too old and too distinct to have formed during a quick, uninterrupted dash across a land bridge and straight on into the Americas. A full decade later, a much larger team led by researchers at the University of Tartu in Estonia tested that hunch, properly sequencing genetic material from more than 600 Native American volunteers. The pattern held up, and held up clearly. Something in the genetic record pointed toward a population that had sat still, cut off from relatives back in Asia for thousands of years before ever moving further south into the wider Americas. That idea eventually earned itself a name almost as evocative as the discovery underneath it, the Beringian standstill. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it quietly rewrites an entire chapter of human history most of us never questioned in the first place. The old simple story pictured small bands of hunters walking briskly across a temporary strip of land ice fixed firmly on the unclaimed continent, waiting on the far side, barely pausing to unpack. The newer stranger story suggests something closer to the opposite. An entire population may have settled into that vanished middle ground, built lives. There raised families there, buried their dead there for a stretch of time. Some researchers now place it somewhere between 8,000 and 15,000 years, an entire civilization's worth of generations living on a country that exists today only as data pulled from human genomes and a scattering of ancient plant fragments buried under the modern seafloor. Try imagining for a moment an entire homeland that has no name written down anywhere. No ruins you could visit, no photographs, nothing left standing above the waterline at all. The only proof it ever existed sits inside the cells of people who have never once needed to think about it to go about their ordinary lives. Physical confirmation when it eventually arrived came from a burial site much further south and considerably more recent, dated to around 11,500 years ago in what is now interior Alaska, well after the standstill itself had likely ended, and people had already begun spreading deeper into the Americas. Genetic material recovered there carried lineages that, at the time, showed up nowhere else in the known genetic record of Asia, only in populations scattered much further south across the Americas. Finding lineages that distinct that early and that far north fit neatly with the idea of a long isolated population upstream of it, one whose full genetic diversity had already been building for thousands of years before that particular burial site was ever put to rest. Not every researcher is fully convinced, and it is worth saying so plainly rather than pretending this debate is settled. A few geneticists point to something called genetic surfing, a pattern where a small founding population, expanding rapidly across an enormous new territory, can end up looking in the DNA left behind almost exactly like a population that spent thousands of years sitting still. Picture a handful of families spreading out fast across empty land, each new generation pushing a little further than the last. Certain rare mutations can end up riding along at the leading edge of that expansion, purely by chance growing common in the new territory, for no reason beyond who happened to be standing at the front of the line producing a genetic signature that on paper can be difficult to tell, apart from centuries of quiet, settled isolation. Untangling those two possibilities from genetic data alone without more physical sites to check against remains stubbornly difficult, mostly because the single best place to go looking for those sites now sits under more than 100 meters of the Bering Sea. Maybe an entire hidden nation really did spend its whole existence on that vanished plain generation after generation before ever setting foot in the Americas at all. Maybe the truth is closer to a faster, messier spread across a huge, thinly peopled landscape, leaving behind a genetic pattern that only resembles a long standstill from a distance. Or maybe, and this feels like the honest note to leave it on both processes, were happening in different corners of that same vast vanished country at once, and the full answer is still sitting somewhere out of reach, sealed under cold water. Nobody has fully searched yet. If your attention wants to soften and blur a little here, let it. None of this needs solving tonight, least of all by you. Let your shoulders drop and let the whole argument keep circling quietly on its own, somewhere far off in the background. Here's something worth asking yourself while you drift if you're still awake enough to enjoy the question. If your own family's story stretched back far enough, would you rather it turned out you came from people who settled somewhere and stayed patient and rooted for thousands of years, or from people who kept moving restless and quick, chasing open ground the moment it appeared? There is no wrong answer. Most of us, if the genetics of this particular argument are any guide, probably descend from a little of both. Now travel with me for a moment clear across the globe, because the very same kind of quiet erasure was unfolding on almost the opposite side of the planet, at almost exactly the same stretch of time, and it deserves its own moment before we move any further. Southeast Asia at the height of the Ice Age was not the scattering of islands filling a map today. Sumatra, Java, Borneo and the Malay Peninsula sat joined together as one enormous low fertile landmass, stretching out from the Asian mainland like a great green thumb pressed into the sea. Researchers now call it Sunderland, and at its largest it ranked among the biggest single landmasses anywhere on Earth, rich with rivers, wetlands and forest home to modern humans for something on the order of 50 to 70,000 years before any of this began drowning. The place was not simply large, it was extraordinarily alive, the kind of landscape that today in the fragments still standing above water is credited with sheltering something near 1 in every 6 bird species found anywhere on the planet. Here's what's remarkable about how that particular loss unfolded. It did not happen at one steady, gentle pace. Deep-sea sediment records point instead to at least 3 distinct dramatic pulses of especially rapid sea level rise roughly around 14,500 years ago, 11,500 years ago, and again around 7,500 years ago. During the sharpest of those pulses, sea level appears to have climbed by something in the neighbourhood of 18 metres in only a few hundred years, a pace fast enough that a single long human lifetime could plausibly have watched a familiar shoreline retreat by a noticeable unsettling amount. Picture that for a second if you can hold both scales in your head at once. Not a single flood sweeping through overnight and finish by morning. Something closer to a slow-motion siege arriving in distinct brutal surges every few thousand years, each one swallowing a little more of a homeland that in between those surges must have felt entirely solid and permanent again. A grandmother might have spent her whole childhood on ground that her own grandchildren would only ever know as open water, and in between those two lives no single terrifying night would have marked the difference. Only a slow accumulation of smaller, stranger years, each one a little wetter than memory insisted it should be. If your eyes are heavy by now, that is exactly where they are meant to be. Let this next stretch wash over you the way that water once washed over Sunderland's slow patient, and in no particular hurry to be understood all at once. By the time the water finally settled somewhere near where it sits today, Sunderland had lost well over half. The land area it once carried at the height of the Ice Age splitting apart into the scattered islands and shallow seas that define the region now. Populations that had once been able to walk freely between what are now separate countries found themselves stranded instead, sorted onto individual islands, by nothing more deliberate than where the water happened to stop rising. Some of their descendants are still there today. Certain indigenous communities scattered across the Malay Peninsula, the Philippines and the Andaman Islands trace an unusually deep, continuous line back toward those original Sunderland populations, carrying in their own way a present-day echo of a homeland that mostly exists now as seabed. There is something worth sitting with in that detail, specifically something a little more tender than a raw geological fact. Two completely different, entirely unconnected corners of the world, Beringia in the far north Sunderland near the equator, were living through fundamentally the same kind of loss at almost exactly the same moment in history, without either one having the faintest idea the other existed at all. Different oceans, different peoples, different plants and animals entirely. The same patient in different water, rising for the same underlying reason, quietly redrawing the boundaries of who could reach whom on foot. There is a strange comfort tucked inside that coincidence too, if you let yourself sit with it. Loss on this scale was never really a local misfortune. It was something closer to a universal experience quietly shared at almost the same moment by people who never once heard of each other. It is worth pausing too on how strange it must have felt generation after generation to watch a familiar path simply stop working. Not a war closing a border, not a wall built by human hands, just water arriving a little further inland each season, until a route your grandparents walked without a second thought had become for you something only a story could still cross. There is something almost funny in a very dry sort of way about how much of this particular chapter of human history had to be pieced back together from blood samples and sediment cores, rather than any ruin left standing in plain sight. No grand stone doorway, no collapsed temple wall to photograph for a documentary crew. Somewhere out there tonight a geneticist is very likely still squinting at a spreadsheet full of mutations, trying to decide whether a stubborn cluster of data points represents 10,000 years of quiet homesteading, or one fast, messy sprint across open ground. It is in its own understated way still one of the more romantic jobs a person could have, reading an entire vanished country's history out of nothing but the invisible fine print carried inside somebody's own cells. Whatever finally severed those two ancient connections, water rising steadily in the North Water arriving in violent surges near the equator. The loss of open, walkable land was only ever half the story unfolding across this transformed world. Something else was disappearing right alongside it, something considerably larger and considerably louder than any strip of drowned coastline, something that left no ambiguous genetic pattern for a lab to argue over, only bones scattered across entire continents belonging to animals the size of small buildings that this planet would never see the likes of again. And its absence would turn out to be just as hard for the people left behind to fully explain. Bones scattered across entire continents belonging to animals the size of small buildings that this planet would never see the likes of again. Say the word megafauna, and it can sound almost clinical, a tidy label for something that was in reality anything but tidy. Ground sloths taller than a basketball hoop, standing up on their back legs to strip leaves from branches with claws, long enough to hook an entire tree limb down toward their mouths. Beavers the size of a modern black bear capable of gnawing down trees, most people today would need a chainsaw to fell. Cats with canine teeth longer than a kitchen knife, built not for speed but for a single devastating ambush strike. Armadillo-like creatures wearing shells the size of a small car dragging spiked tails behind them, like something out of a story nobody would believe if the bones themselves were not sitting in museum drawers to prove it. And mammoths, of course, the animal this whole icebound world seemed to organize itself around, standing taller at the shoulder than most doorframes built today, moving in herds that could shake the ground the way we already spent time imagining earlier tonight. All of it gone within what looks on a geological timescale like the blink of an eye. Here's the question that has kept two generations of scientists in a fairly heated, occasionally personal argument. Did that happen because the world around these animals simply changed too fast for them to keep up with? Or did it happen because a brand new predator arrived on the scene, one these animals had never learned to be afraid of, and hunted them into oblivion before they ever had the chance to learn? The trail that eventually lit this whole argument on fire starts appropriately enough in a dusty gravel pit outside a small town in New Mexico that happens to share its name with the culture discovered there. In the 1930s, workers digging through an old stream bed kept turning up mammoth bones, mixed together with a very particular, very deliberate style of stone spear, point-thin, elegant, with a distinctive groove cut into the base on both sides, clearly made to be lashed tightly onto a wooden shaft. Whoever made these points was not fumbling around with crude tools. They were precise, practiced, and clearly comfortable enough around an animal that could crush a person underfoot to actually go hunting one. Hold one of these points in your hand today, and it barely looks like a weapon at all. It looks closer to a small, deliberate piece of sculpture, the kind of object a craftsperson spends real time getting exactly right, knowing their own life would depend on the results. Archaeologists named the culture Clovis after the town, and for a long stretch of the 20th century, Clovis held a very particular, very confident title, the first people in the Americas full stop arriving roughly 13,000 years ago, and within what appeared to be an almost suspiciously short window, afterward watching an entire menagerie of giant animals disappear around them. That timing is exactly what caught the attention of a fossil pollen specialist turned extinction detective named Paul Martin working out of the University of Arizona. Martin looked at that overlap, Clovis hunters arriving, giant animals vanishing almost immediately after, and proposed something that would end up defining the rest of his career, and honestly occasionally making him one of the more argued about figures at any conference on the subject. He called it the overkill hypothesis, though colleagues eventually gave it a punchier, more dramatic nickname, Blitzkrieg. His argument, laid out most forcefully in the early 1970s, was straightforward and more than a little unsettling. These animals had never seen anything like a human being before. They had no evolved instinct to run, no learned fear, nothing built into their behavior, warning them that a two-legged creature carrying a sharpened stick represented mortal danger. A population of highly skilled hunters, moving into an entire continent full of unsuspecting prey, could plausibly have swept from north to south in a matter of centuries, leaving an emptied landscape behind them the whole way. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment if you can hold it gently rather than let it turn unsettling. Try to imagine standing in a green field, a truly enormous animal, grazing calmly only a short distance away, and that animal simply does not react to you at all because it has never once had a reason to. No flinch, no retreat, just calm, uncomprehending curiosity staring back at the single, most dangerous new species its entire evolutionary history never prepared it for. Martin's case landed with real force, and for a while it more or less became the accepted story taught plainly in textbooks as settled fact. But it did not sit unchallenged for long, and the challenges came from more than one direction at once. The most obvious competing explanation simply pointed back at everything we have already spent time with tonight. This was, after all, exactly the same stretch of centuries when the mammoth steppe itself was unravelling, when a climate whiplash was busy turning rich grassland into patchy forest and boggy tundra, far too quickly for animals built for open grazing to properly adjust. Lose the food, lose the habitat, and you do not need a single spear thrown to explain an extinction. The land itself was already pulling the floor out from under these species before any hunter ever raised a weapon. Then came a second, quieter kind of challenge, one that ended up cutting even deeper into Martin's original timeline. Over the following decades, archaeologists kept turning up sites in places like southern Chile, with clear evidence of human habitation dating back well before Clovis technology ever existed. If people had already been living in the Americas for thousands of years before that first fluted spear point was ever chipped into shape, the entire tidy picture of a single rapid first contact blitzkrieg started looking considerably messier than Martin's original story allowed for. Entire academic careers on both sides of this argument have now been built, defended, and occasionally quietly abandoned over exactly how messy that picture really is. Here's what's remarkable about how the field has actually settled, or rather largely refused to settle on any one clean answer since. Most researchers working on this today lean towards some kind of combination, rather than picking a single villain. An already weakened, climate-stressed population, its habitat shrinking and shifting under it, meeting a skilled, opportunistic new predator at almost exactly its most vulnerable moment is a very different and considerably more plausible story than either explanation manages entirely on its own. There is even a pattern worth noticing across the different continents involved. Africa and parts of southern Asia, where large mammals had been living alongside evolving humans for a very long stretch of shared history, lost noticeably fewer giant species during this same window, almost as though generations of gradual mutual familiarity had given both predator and prey time to adjust to each other. The Americas and Australia, reached by humans comparatively late, and suddenly tell a far more abrupt, far more devastating story. That pattern alone, continents with a longer shared history, losing less continents, meeting humans for the first time, losing catastrophically more quietly, nudges the argument back toward human involvement, mattering a great deal, even if climate was doing plenty of damage on its own at the very same time. Sometimes the hardest, most honest scientific answer really is both at once arriving together, each one making the other more lethal than it would have been alone. If your body wants to sink a little deeper into the blankets right about now, let it. There is no final verdict waiting at the end of this particular argument tonight, only two respectable ideas leaning on each other, and that is a perfectly comfortable place for your own attention to rest as well. Now here is where the story does something most people never expect tucked away on two tiny islands. Most maps barely bother labelling. Picture Wrangel Island, a stretch of Arctic land off the coast of Siberia cut off from the mainland as rising seas swallowed the surrounding lowlands. Mammoths stranded there, isolated from the mainland catastrophe unfolding everywhere else, simply kept living. Not for another few centuries, for another 7,000 years. Radiocarbon dating on their remains places the very last of them at somewhere around 4,000 years ago, which puts these particular mammoths remarkably wandering around at roughly the same moment ancient Egyptian workers were stacking the final stones on the Great Pyramids. Sit with that comparison for a second because it deserves a moment of genuine astonishment. While the mainland had emptied out entirely, while entire human civilizations were already busy inventing, writing and building monuments, actual living, breathing woolly mammoths were still grazing quietly on a remote Arctic island, completely unbothered by any of it. Here's a question worth turning over while that image settles. If you had to guess before hearing any of this, how recently would you have assumed the very last mammoth on Earth actually died? 100,000 years ago? 50,000? Most people guess numbers wildly larger than 4,000, and most people understandably guess wrong. A second smaller island tells an even stranger story, and this one carries a twist that reshapes the whole debate all over again. St. Paul Island off the coast of Alaska held its own isolated mammoth population, surviving until around 5,600 years ago, well over 1,000 years after their Wrangel Island cousins had already begun their own remarkable extra chapter. Here is the detail that matters most. No human ever set foot on St. Paul Island until Russian sailors arrived by ship in the late 1700s, thousands of years after those mammoths had already vanished completely. Whatever killed the mammoths of St. Paul Island, it was not a hunter, not a spear, not a single human footprint anywhere near them. Nature left entirely to its own devices on that one small island still finished the job on its own. Researchers eventually traced their disappearance to something considerably less dramatic than a hunt, and in its own way considerably sadder. As the island slowly shrank under rising water, its single freshwater lake grew smaller and saltier along with it. Sediment pulled from that lake bed shows a population running out of clean water to drink stranded on a shrinking island with nowhere left to go, dying out not from violence, but from simple grinding thirst. A paleontologist who spent years piecing this particular mystery together once described finding a single, perfectly preserved mammoth tooth tucked inside a collapsed lava tube on the island, sitting there untouched for thousands of years waiting for someone with a flashlight and enough patience to finally climb down and notice it. Here's what that quiet little island does to the whole argument, and it is worth sitting with properly rather than rushing past. If an entire isolated population of mammoths, one that never once encountered a human being, still went extinct on its own, purely from environmental pressure, then climate and habitat loss clearly had the power to finish this story entirely by themselves, at least in certain places under certain conditions. And if Wrangel Island mammoths cut off from any Clovis hunter still managed to survive 7,000 years longer than their mainland cousins, then whatever ended the mainland population so much faster very likely had a great deal to do with pressures those isolated island herds simply never faced. Maybe mainland megafauna really did fall primarily to human hunters moving fast and efficient across an unsuspecting continent. Maybe climate alone would eventually have finished the job, even without a single spear thrown the way it clearly did on St. Paul Island, given enough time and enough isolation. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest way to leave two very different islands sitting side by side tonight. Different populations in different corners of the world died for entirely different reasons, and the search for one single, tidy villain behind an entire planet's worth of extinctions was always going to come up a little short. There is something almost funny in a dark, dry sort of way about two scientists able to build entire careers arguing over whether it was spears or salt water that did the killing, while a tiny population of mammoths on a forgotten island quietly outlasted the argument itself by several thousand years, indifferent to either theory, simply grazing until the water finally ran out. Whatever combination of forces finally emptied out that world of giants, one thing is worth sitting with, honestly, before we move on. Every single explanation on the table, hunting habitat, collapse, isolation, thirst, points back to the exact same root cause we have been circling all night. A world was changing faster than the creatures living in it had ever had to adapt to before, and not every living thing on that changing landscape had the option of simply walking somewhere else, or waiting quietly on an island for 7,000 extra years. Some found islands, most did not, and the ones that did not simply vanish whole and complete so thoroughly that entire generations of humans who came after would grow up never once suspecting the ground they walked on had ever shaken under the weight of anything that size at all. And with all those giant grazers gone, the very same grasslands that had once fed millions of them stopped needing to be grassland at all. What grew back in their place, and what human beings eventually chose to do with that newly empty, newly quiet ground, would end up changing the direction of this entire species far more permanently than any single extinction ever could. What grew back in that newly empty, newly quiet ground, and what human beings eventually chose to do with it, starts oddly enough with a lake that got tired of keeping its own secrets. In 1989, a punishing stretch of drought settled over northern Israel and the Sea of Galilee, already strained by years of heavy water. Pumping dropped nearly 30 feet below its usual shoreline. Fishermen grumbled, farmers worried. Local officials fretted over reservoir numbers on the evening news. And somewhere along the newly exposed southwestern shore, a strange, dark outline began emerging from the drying mud, the unmistakable footprint of old, collapsed huts, sitting exactly where no lakeshore should ever have let anyone build anything at all. Archaeologists from the University of Haifa moved in fast racing the water itself, since everyone involved understood the lake could easily rise again and swallow the site before anyone finished looking at it properly. What they found over those brief dry seasons turned out to be a settlement nearly 23,000 years old, 6 brush hut foundations, a human burial, and an almost absurdly well-preserved scatter of plant remains somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 individual seeds and fragments protected all that time by the very mud and water that had kept everyone else from ever finding it. Here's what's remarkable about one particular object sitting inside that mud. A single flat grinding stone worn smooth on top set carefully into the floor of one hut and stabilized with a few packed pebbles so it would not wobble during use tested later for traces of ancient starch. Wild wheat, wild barley, even wild oats. Someone at that lakeside camp roughly 23,000 years ago was already grinding wild grain into something closer to flour thousands of years before anyone would call this activity farming, and roughly 11,000 years before most textbooks place the actual beginning of agriculture anywhere on Earth. Sit with that gap for a second because it quietly upends a story most of us never thought to question. Agriculture is usually presented as a single clever spark one bright morning when somebody finally figured out that a dropped seed grows into a new plant. The truth sitting in that Galilee mud looks considerably messier and honestly a great deal more human. Researchers combing through the site even found traces of certain weed species, the exact kind of plants that tend to spring up specifically around disturbed tilled soil, hinting that someone at that lakeside camp may have been experimenting with small-scale planting deliberately on purpose more than 20,000 years before the idea finally stuck for good anywhere else. That particular experiment, whatever it amounted to, did not last. The climate at the time was still locked deep in the coldest, driest stretch of the Ice Age, and whatever these lakeside foragers were trying apparently could not compete with simply moving on to wherever wild food happened to be more reliable that season. An idea that gets tried once abandoned and then tried again thousands of years apart in different places by people who never knew anyone else had already thought of it first. Fast forward a very long stretch of time and the story properly settles into the region most people picture when they hear the word agriculture. At all a curved arc of land running from the eastern Mediterranean coast up through what is now Turkey and down along the valleys of two great rivers, a stretch researchers eventually nicknamed the Fertile Crescent. And the people who lived there right before farming truly began have their own name too, one worth getting to know a little, because their story carries most of the real emotional weight of what happened next, the Natufians. For a truly comfortable stretch of centuries, roughly 12,500 years ago onward, the early Natufians had, without ever needing to plant a single seed, stumbled into something near paradise by hunter-gatherer standards. Wild wheat and barley grew thick and abundant across the hillsides. They built real, semi-permanent villages instead of simply passing through some with round stone-footed houses, sturdy enough to be repaired and reused across several generations rather than abandoned after a single season. They dug storage pits lined with stone to keep surplus grain through lean months, an early kind of insurance policy against a bad year. They tamed dogs to share their camps, the beginning of a partnership between our two species that has never really ended since, and in a detail that tends to delight people more than almost anything else, in this particular corner of history they brewed beer. Here's a fact worth turning over slowly because it sounds almost like a joke until you realize it is backed by actual laboratory analysis. Stone mortars pulled from a burial cave near modern Haifa, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, still carried microscopic residue of malted wheat and barley that had been deliberately fermented, brewed specifically to be served at funeral feasts honoring the dead. That means, as strange as it sounds, human beings may well have figured out how to make beer before they ever figured out how to reliably grow bread. If you needed one more reason to feel a little tenderness toward the people who came before us, there it is. Faced with grief and with grain, someone's very first instinct was apparently to throw a party. None of this, though, stayed comfortable forever, because right in the middle of that Natufian golden age, the very same brutal cold snap we spent considerable time with earlier tonight arrived and refused to leave for over 1,000 years. Rainfall thinned. Wild wheat and barley, which had spread generously across the hillsides during the good years, pulled back into smaller, patchier stands, retreating toward the wetter valleys, the way a tide slowly abandons a beach. Some Natufian communities abandoned their settled villages entirely and returned to a more mobile, wandering way of life, chasing an increasingly unreliable harvest, instead of simply waiting for it to arrive at their doorstep. Here's a question worth sitting with if you have ever had to give up a comfortable routine because the world around you simply stopped cooperating with it. Picture spending your whole childhood in one particular house, secure in the assumption that house would always be there, only to watch your own parents pack up and start wandering again, because the ground itself could no longer support staying still. That roughly was the emotional shape of what an entire generation of Natufians lived through, watching a settled, comfortable inheritance quietly come apart around them. Here's the honest, slightly contested part of this story, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than tidied up into something cleaner than it actually is. Many researchers argue that this stretch of hardship is exactly what pushed people toward truly deliberate cultivation, for the first time planting seeds on purpose as a direct practical response to a shrinking wild harvest they could no longer simply count on. Other researchers push back on that story, pointing out that solid physical evidence for actual planting during this specific window remains frustratingly thin, and arguing instead for a messier, more resilient picture, one where these communities adapted and readapted repeatedly through more than one hard stretch, rather than being pushed in one clean single motion straight from foraging into farming by a single bad millennium. It is worth noticing too that this same argument echoes something we have already circled more than once tonight: the temptation to reach for one dramatic villain behind an enormous change when the truthful answer usually turns out to involve several smaller, quieter pressures arriving together. Maybe the cold and the drought really did force the issue, directly planting the very first deliberate seeds out of pure necessity. Maybe the truth is closer to a slower, more stubborn kind of trial and error stretched out across many hard seasons rather than one dramatic turning point. Or maybe, and this feels like the honest place to leave it resting tonight, both things were happening at once in different valleys, some communities improvising boldly under pressure, others simply enduring, and the full tangled picture is still being pieced together one excavated seed at a time. If your body wants to settle a little heavier into the mattress right about now, let it. There is nothing urgent sitting inside any of this only patient people, patient plants, and an argument that has been running gently for decades without any real hurry to resolve itself tonight. Whatever combination of pressure and patience finally tipped the balance, once that same brutal cold finally broke roughly 11,700 years ago, the climate settled into something truly stable for the first time in a very long while, and this time the shift toward real sustained farming did not slip backward again. Villages that had once diminished or scattered came roaring back this time, properly cultivating grain rather than simply gathering whatever the hillsides happened to offer that season, which brings us to one of the more satisfying detective stories hiding inside this whole chapter. For a long time, nobody could say with any real confidence exactly where out of that entire sweeping arc of fertile land farming had first taken hold. Then in the late 1990s, a geneticist named Manfred Huhn set out to answer that question the same way a crime lab might identify a suspect, by comparing genetic fingerprints. His team collected hundreds of samples of wild einkorn wheat from across the entire Fertile Crescent, from western Turkey down through Syria and Iraq, cataloguing each plant's precise collection point on a map, then compared each one against the genetic profile of modern domesticated einkorn, the direct ancestor of the bread most of us have eaten at some point this very week. It was slow, painstaking work running hundreds of genetic markers through comparison after comparison, the botanical equivalent of matching a fingerprint left at a scene against an enormous scattered database of suspects. Out of every wild population tested across that entire sweeping arc of land, one single specific location stood out clearly above all the others, a range of volcanic hills in southeastern Turkey called Karakada. Hun himself later compared the whole process to forensic detective work, matching a genetic fingerprint back to one exact location on the map, and admitted the moment the results finally lined up so cleanly felt almost too satisfying to trust at first. And here is the detail that makes this particular result feel almost too tidy to be true. Several of the other founding crops of this entire agricultural revolution, chickpeas, bit of etch an early relative of Emma wheat, trace their own genetic roots back to that very same small cluster of hills, rather than being scattered evenly across the whole vast region, the way anyone might reasonably have expected. Here's a question worth sitting with quietly before we move on. The next time you eat literally anything made from wheat, a slice of bread, a bowl of pasta, a simple cracker, there is a real traceable chance that the entire lineage behind that mouthful runs backward, generation after generation, plant after plant, to wild grass, once growing on one particular hillside in what is now southeastern Turkey. Not a whole continent's worth of independent invention. One small, specific place discovered by one people spreading outward from there to feed most of the planet. There is something worth sitting with in that fact beyond the trivia of it. An entire species didn't simply drift toward farming everywhere at once, the way water eventually finds every low spot in a landscape. It happened as far as the genetics can tell us in a small number of specific places shaped by specific people, under specific pressure, and then spread outward from there with a persistence that eventually reshaped nearly every diet on Earth. History, it turns out, often narrows down to a remarkably small handful of decisions made by people who had no idea how far those decisions would eventually travel. There is something almost funny in its own quiet way about how much of this story keeps circling back to alcohol and grinding stones rather than anything resembling a grand deliberate master plan. No single visionary stood on a hillside and declared farming the future of the species. Just hungry people, thirsty people, patient people, trying things, failing at some of them, and occasionally almost by accident stumbling onto something that would outlast every one of them by roughly 12,000 years. If you had told any of them mid-sip at a Natufian funeral feast that their little experiment with fermented grain mash would eventually underwrite entire empires, stock markets and grocery store aisles, they likely would have laughed and poured you another cup. If your eyes are heavy and your thoughts are wandering somewhere pleasant right about now, that is exactly where they belong. Nothing left in this particular story needs sharp focus. Just let the picture of that quiet, muddy lake shore and those patient hillside villages settle in gently. And that same stretch of hills near Karakadar, it turns out, was hiding one more surprise sitting only a short distance away, that would eventually force archaeologists to rethink the entire order in which this part of human history was supposed to have unfolded in the first place. Something enormous deliberately built, and by every conventional assumption anyone had carried into that region for the better part of a century, something that should not have existed yet at all. Something enormous, deliberately built, and by every conventional assumption anyone had carried into that region for the better part of a century, something that should not have existed yet at all. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University walked across a low, unremarkable hill in southeastern Turkey, noted some broken limestone slabs poking out of the dirt, and moved on without much interest at all. Their notes politely filed the place away as nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery, a few worn tombstones sitting on a hilltop unworthy of any real attention. For over 30 years, that verdict simply sat there unquestioned, gathering dust in an archive somewhere. Then in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt walked the same hill, looked at the same broken stones, and felt something click that nobody else apparently had. He had spent years working other sites nearby, and something about the shape of this particular hilltop, unusually rounded, unusually deliberate against the surrounding landscape, kept nagging at him. The proportions looked wrong for grave markers. The flint scattered across the surface looked wrong too, older, cruder, belonging to an era long before anyone in that region had settled down into villages at all. Schmidt later described the moment almost like a physical sensation, the sudden, quiet certainty that everyone before him had been looking at the exact same hill and simply misreading what it was. He reportedly turned to a colleague standing beside him that day and said he could either walk away right now or spend the rest of his working life here. He chose the hill. He was right, and the scale of exactly how right he was would take the rest of his career and considerably more digging to fully reveal. Beneath that unremarkable hilltop sat an entire complex of massive stone enclosures, arranged in rough circles built around towering T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing nearly 10 tons apiece. Carved across their broad limestone faces in relief work confident enough to suggest real practice skill were foxes, boars, cranes, snakes, scorpions and vultures, along with a handful of stylized human arms and hands, as if the pillars themselves were meant to represent enormous silent figures standing watch. Nobody working the site today can tell you with any real confidence what those animals meant to the people who carved them, whether they marked constellations, clan identities, warnings, or something closer to a story passed down so many times. Its original meaning simply wore away the way water eventually smooths the sharpest edge off a stone. Radiocarbon dating on material recovered from the earliest layer placed construction at somewhere around 11,600 years ago. Here's the number that actually detonated inside archaeology when it finally sank in properly. 11,600 years puts this site roughly 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and more than 7,000 years older than the pyramids at Giza. It predates pottery. It predates the wheel. It predates writing metal tools. And most explosively of all, it predates agriculture itself in that exact region by at least 1,000 years. Every scrap of evidence dug out of the ground around those pillars, animal bone stone tools, plant remains points to one specific, uncomfortable conclusion. The people who quarried, carved, hauled and erected these enormous stones were still hunter-gatherers. Sit with that for a second, because the field of archaeology truly had to. For most of the 20th century, the accepted story ran in one clean, tidy direction. People settle down. People start farming. Farming creates surplus food. Surplus food frees up spare time and spare hands. Only then, once a society has that comfortable cushion of stored grain sitting behind it, does anyone have the luxury to build something as elaborate, as impractical, and as purely ceremonial as a temple. Agriculture first, religion and monuments later as a kind of reward for getting the hard part done. This hill flipped that entire sequence upside down. Whatever these enormous carved pillars represented to the people who built them, worship, memory, storytelling. Something we may never fully translate. It existed before farming, not after it. Try imagining for a moment what it would actually take to organize a project like this without any of the tools we usually assume complex societies need. No written records to coordinate schedules. No centralized government issuing orders. No stored granary sitting nearby to guarantee a steady food supply for months of hard physical labor. And yet somehow scattered bands of hunter-gatherers groups that most researchers had always pictured as small, mobile and only loosely connected to their neighbors found a way to gather in large enough numbers, coordinate closely enough, and commit to a project ambitious enough to move 10-ton stones uphill and stand them upright over and over again across at least 20 separate circular enclosures, and archaeologists suspect that number is only a fraction of what still sits unexcavated beneath the surrounding hillside. Archaeologists estimate a single major pillar alone could have required hundreds of workers laboring together over weeks, if not months, dragging raw limestone blocks out of a nearby quarry, using nothing more than rope timber and sheer coordinated human effort. Here's a detail that quietly ties this entire evening's story together in a way that feels almost too neat to be a coincidence. This hill sits only a short distance from the very same volcanic slopes where thousands of years later, genetic detective work traced the origin of domesticated wheat back to one specific mountain range. The place where farming itself was first cracked open, and the place where humanity's first known monumental architecture rose out of the ground to sit practically within sight of each other. Excavators piecing together what actually happened on this hilltop found something else worth sitting with too. Enormous quantities of animal bone gazelle most of all, along with wild cattle and other game scattered across the site, in numbers far beyond what a handful of ordinary meals could account for. Whatever gatherings took place here were not quiet, modest affairs. They involved serious quantities of meat, almost certainly shared out across large groups at once the unmistakable leftovers of genuine feasting, rather than routine everyday eating. Picture something closer to a seasonal festival than a solemn, hushed ceremony, loud with voices cooking fires, and the particular kind of noise that only happens when strangers who rarely see each other finally get the chance to share a meal together again. Klaus Schmidt spent the better part of 2 decades turning that coincidence over in his mind, and he eventually arrived at an idea nearly as bold as the site itself. Perhaps the usual order of events had it backward. Perhaps not surplus grain that made a project like this possible, but the enormous ongoing challenge of feeding hundreds of workers gathered periodically at one hilltop for a shared purpose that pushed people toward the earliest experiments in deliberately managing their food supply in the first place. Feed a crowd like that with wild game and foraged plants alone season after season, and sooner or later somebody starts wondering whether it might be easier to simply grow the food closer to where everyone keeps returning. He put it simply in a phrase that stuck with almost everyone who ever heard him say it. The temple came first and the city came later. Religion in this telling was not the reward civilization handed itself once the hard work was finished. It may have been the very reason civilization got organized enough to begin at all. Here's a question worth sitting with quietly for a moment if your mind still has the energy to wander somewhere interesting tonight. What could possibly pull complete strangers scattered across an enormous hunting territory away from the everyday urgency of finding their next meal and convince them instead to spend weeks of back-breaking labor, raising stones for reasons that had nothing to do with survival at all? Whatever that pull actually was or fear grief, a shared story about the sky or the animals carved into those pillars, it was apparently strong enough to organize the first known large-scale cooperative project in the entire history of our species. And remember, everything Schmidt and his team ever excavated amounts to only a small fraction of the site. Ground-penetrating surveys suggest the vast majority of it, likely dozens more enclosures, still sits quietly underground, waiting for a future generation of archaeologists none of us will ever meet. Not everyone studying the site today agrees entirely with Schmidt's original picture, and it is worth being honest about that rather than smoothing the story over. Schmidt argued firmly that this hilltop had no residential population at all, purely a gathering place, visited periodically and never properly lived in a case he built, partly on the total absence of ordinary domestic clutter. No obvious hearths, no storage bins, none of the everyday debris an actual village tends to leave scattered everywhere. An archaeologist named Ted Banning pushed back on that claim fairly early, arguing the buildings looked less like a temple and more like unusually large, unusually elaborate houses, places where ordinary daily life and ritual life were simply woven together rather than kept apart. After Schmidt's death in 2014, further excavation led by researchers continuing his work turned up hints that complicate his original picture even further, including possible hearths, signs of water collection, and in at least one case a burial tucked beneath the floor of one of the structures. None of that necessarily proves people lived there full-time in the earliest layers, but it does suggest the clean line Schmidt originally drew Sacred Temple on one side Ordinary daily life, on the other, may have been a little blurrier in practice than his first boldest telling of the story allowed for. Maybe this hilltop really was a purely ceremonial gathering place visited periodically by people who lived their actual lives elsewhere exactly as Schmidt first proposed. Maybe it was closer to an unusually elaborate, unusually sacred settlement where daily life and ritual life were never as cleanly separated as later generations like to imagine. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave 2 decades of careful, occasionally sharp-elbowed academic argument. Tonight the answer changed over time, shifting slowly from one kind of place into another. Across the many centuries this hilltop stayed in use, and the pillars themselves are simply not finished telling us which version of that story is true. If your body wants to sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting right now, let it. None of this needs to be settled before you fall asleep. Great questions rarely announce their own answers on any particular schedule, and this one has already waited 11,000 years without any real urgency about being solved tonight. There is something almost funny in a very dry, very academic way about 2 respected archaeologists spending decades politely disagreeing over whether a handful of ancient hearths prove people lived somewhere or merely prove people occasionally warm their hands there. Careers, reputations, entire theoretical frameworks quietly riding on the presence or absence of a little scorched dirt. Somewhere at an academic conference tonight, that exact argument is almost certainly still happening over coffee in a hallway between 2 people who both truly respect each other and still cannot agree on what a burnt patch of soil 11,000 years old is actually trying to tell them. And there is something considerably less funny, and a great deal more moving sitting underneath that same argument. Whatever this hilltop turns out to have precisely been sanctuary half-settled village, or something that slowly drifted between the two across many generations. The people who built it clearly believed it mattered enough to justify enormous sustained cooperative effort at a point in human history when survival alone should, by every old assumption, have consumed every scrap of their attention. They found room for something else entirely, something that was not about staying alive for one more season, but about marking gathering and remembering. It is worth sitting just for a moment with how deeply that impulse still lives in us tonight. Thousands of generations later, every time a stranger lights a candle for someone they lost, or a whole town gathers for no practical reason at all, beyond the simple comfort of standing together. Eventually, and for reasons still not fully understood, the people who kept returning to this hilltop began deliberately burying it, filling in enclosure after enclosure with rubble and soil sometime around 10,000 years ago, as though closing their door they had decided together not to open again. Some researchers wonder whether the rise of full farming nearby simply pulled people's attention and their labour elsewhere for good. Others suspect something closer to a deliberate ceremonial ending, a final act as intentional as the first stone ever raised. Whatever conversation led to that final decision left no other trace behind. Not far from that quietly buried hilltop, and not so very long afterward, the world would keep proving again and again that endings rarely stay buried for good. One particular ending, tied to a piece of land we spent real time with earlier tonight, was still waiting its turn, patient as anything else in this story, and it was about to arrive in the form of a wave large enough to finish once and for all, something the sea had already been chipping away at for thousands of quiet years. A wave large enough to finish once and for all something the sea had already been chipping away at for thousands of quiet years. Sometime in the 1970s, engineers working for Norway's Continental Shelf Institute were doing exactly the kind of unglamorous, careful work that rarely makes headlines. They were mapping the sea floor off Norway's coast, bouncing sound waves down into the dark, checking the ground beneath proposed drilling sites for the kind of stability an oil platform needs before anyone commits to building one. The North Sea by that decade had turned into one of the most valuable stretches of water on the planet, and nobody wanted to spend a fortune anchoring a rig to seabed that might not hold. What they found instead was a scar, not a small one, a long ragged wound cut into the continental shelf itself, beginning roughly 60 miles off Norway's coast and stretching outward deeper and darker for nearly 1,000 miles into the open ocean. They had stumbled onto the aftermath of a catastrophe most of the world had never once suspected existed, buried under water for over 8,000 years. Geologists eventually named it Storegga, an old Norwegian phrase meaning roughly the Great Edge, and the more carefully they studied it, the more the sheer scale of what had happened there refused to sit comfortably in the mind. Somewhere around 8,200 years ago, an enormous section of the continental shelf, an amount of sediment and rock comparable in size to an entire country like Denmark, broke loose all at once and slid down into the deep ocean basin. Most researchers now believe an undersea earthquake weakened the slope just enough to send that whole vast weight sliding, though the exact final trigger buried under so much time and so much water is still debated among the specialists who study it in the most detail. A smaller number of researchers have floated another possibility worth mentioning honestly, rather than glossing over frozen deposits of methane trapped inside the seabed, the kind that can destabilize as ocean temperatures shift, potentially weakening the slope from within at the same time an earthquake struck it from outside. Whether one of those factors did the real work alone, or whether it took both arriving together to finally tip an already unstable slope past its limit remains an open question. Nobody has fully closed the book on. Here's what happens when a mass that size drops into an ocean all at once. It does not simply sink quietly. It shoves an almost unimaginable volume of water out of its way in every direction, all at the same instant, and that displaced water has nowhere sensible to go except outward, in a series of towering waves radiating from the collapse point, like ripples from a stone, except the stone in this case weighed roughly as much as a small nation. Researchers studying the slide structure later found evidence it likely failed in stages, rather than one single clean collapse, several sections giving way in quick succession, which may explain why coastal sites hit by the wave often show not one clean layer of sand but a double pulse, an initial surge followed by a second, only slightly gentler one arriving right behind it. Models built from the surviving evidence suggest those waves reached something near 20 to 25 meters high by the time they struck the Shetland Islands, 10 to 12 meters along the coast of Norway itself, and something in the range of 3 to 6 meters by the time they finally reach the eastern coast of Scotland. To put that smallest number in perspective, a wave only 3 meters tall is still roughly the height of a basketball hoop, arriving all at once carrying the weight and speed of an entire ocean. Behind it across ground people had built homes and hearths on for generations. And this was not some slow gathering swell people might have watched building on the horizon for an hour beforehand. Travelling at the speed open ocean, water moves at that kind of depth. The wave likely reached the Shetland and Faroe Islands in about an hour and a half, and struck the eastern coast of Britain within 2 to 3 hours of that first silent collapse hundreds of miles away. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment if you can hold it gently rather than let it turn frightening. Picture an entirely ordinary morning, calm water, familiar coastline, nothing on the horizon to suggest anything unusual at all, and then within the span of a single normal breakfast, a wall of water taller than a 3-story building arriving with almost no warning whatsoever. What would you even do with those 2 or 3 hours if you somehow knew? Would you run for the highest ground you could reach, or would you spend those final quiet hours simply gathering the people you loved near enough to face it together? For decades after that first seafloor scar turned up, nobody could say for certain exactly where or how hard that wave had actually come ashore. That confirmation came a bit later through a considerably quieter kind of detective work. Researchers combing through coastal sediment in Scotland during the 1980s kept finding something strange tucked into otherwise ordinary layers of ancient peat, a single distinct band of sand and pebbles clearly out of place, clearly delivered by something violent sitting at exactly the depth that matched the Storegga slide's timing. A team led by researchers including Sue Dawson spent years tracing that same layer along the Scottish coastline, eventually publishing findings describing it without much exaggeration as a record-breaking height for an 8,000-year-old tsunami anywhere in the North Atlantic. That same telltale layer eventually turned up at sites well inland too, in one case along the Northumberland coast of England, where researchers drilling down found a sand and pebble deposit nearly 1.5 feet thick material that geologists believe was ripped directly off the seabed near Norway and hurled across the North Sea before it ever settled back to Earth. Sit with that detail for a second because it deserves real weight. Sand and stone quarried by force from one country's coastline delivered by the same wave onto another country's shore hundreds of miles away in a matter of hours. Now here is where this whole story finally closes a loop we opened together at the very start of tonight's journey. By the time this wave struck the land connecting Britain to the rest of mainland Europe, was already nowhere near the wide green country it had been thousands of years earlier. Centuries of steadily rising water had already worn it down into something closer to a scattered archipelago, low islands and sandbanks poking up out of an increasingly crowded, increasingly hostile sea. Whatever hunters and families still called that shrinking waterlogged country home were already living on borrowed ground, watching their world narrow season by season into smaller and smaller pieces. Fishing grounds that had once stretched for miles inland now sat directly at someone's front door. Hunting territory that had supported entire extended families a few generations earlier might by this point barely support 1 or 2 households, pressed closer together on less and less dry ground with every passing decade. A wave of that size arriving with almost no warning at all would have struck whatever remained of that landscape with tremendous force. It is tempting and honestly understandable to treat the single event as the dramatic, tidy final chapter of Doggerland's entire story. The one clean catastrophe that finished off everything. Gradual sea level rise had already been doing quietly for thousands of years. Several respected researchers push back on framing it quite that neatly, and it is worth hearing that pushback rather than smoothing the story into something more satisfying than the evidence fully supports. A careful review published fairly recently argued that Doggerland by this point had already shrunk down to such a small fragmented handful of islands that the tsunami, while undeniably catastrophic wherever it struck, may not have single-handedly delivered the final decisive blow so much as it accelerated an ending that gradual flooding was already nearly finishing on its own. Population estimates for the handful of remaining Mesolithic communities living out there by that point were likely already small, scattered and adapting generation after generation to a homeland that had been shrinking their entire lives. Maybe the Storegga wave really was the single sudden decisive blow that finally erased the last of Doggerland in one terrifying morning. Maybe the truth is gentler and sadder at once, a landscape already reduced to its final few acres of dry ground, absorbing one catastrophic wave among several harder years, in a decline that had been unfolding slowly enough that no single storm or wave could ever fully claim credit for finishing it. Or maybe, and this feels like the honest note to leave it resting on tonight, both things are true, depending on exactly which island, which family, which particular stretch of shoreline you happen to be asking about, since a disaster this size rarely lands with perfectly even weight across everyone it touches. If your body wants to settle a little heavier into wherever you're resting right now, let it. This is not a chapter that needs solving carefully before you drift off. Let the picture of that wave simply arrive and pass the way it did all those thousands of years ago, and let your own evening settle just as quietly in its wake. There is a small mercy tucked inside a disaster this size if you look for it. A wave that arrives and recedes within a single afternoon, violent as it was, is still an ending with an edge to it, A single hard day rather than years of slow grinding uncertainty. Whatever else this wave took from the people who lived through it, it did not drag the wandering out. It simply arrived all at once, and then the water went quiet again. There is something almost startling, if you let yourself sit with it properly, about how neatly this closes the exact story we began with tonight. A trawler working an entirely ordinary night on the North Sea in 1931 dragged up a carved antler point from underneath water that had not always been there. That point belonged to someone who lived on solid ground, in a country that no longer exists on any map, a country whose final disappearance may well have been sealed at least in part by the very same wave we just spent time understanding properly. The fishermen who found that point and the geologists who later found this scar on the seafloor were separated by decades and by entirely different professions, searching for entirely different things, yet both of them ended up reaching into the exact same vanished chapter of the world almost by accident. If you had told either of them the skipper hauling nets full of fish, or the engineers checking seabed stability for an oil rig, that they were both quietly touching the edges of the very same lost country, neither one would likely have believed you. There is something almost funny in its own quiet way about how much of this particular disaster owes its discovery to people who were simply trying to figure out where it was safe to build an oil platform. Nobody set out that year looking for the largest submarine landslide in Europe's recent history. They were checking whether the seafloor was sturdy enough to hold up some very expensive drilling equipment, and stumbled instead into one of the biggest natural disasters this part of the world has ever quietly kept secret. Somewhere in an old company report from that decade buried in dry engineering language about slope stability and seabed composition sits the first written record of one of the worst mornings this stretch of the planet ever had filed away, most likely right next to a perfectly ordinary invoice. Whatever the precise final chapter of Doggerland's disappearance actually looked like, whether it ended in one terrible morning or faded out across several harder decades. One thing about that whole vanished world remains unmistakably true. It was never simply lost to time in some vague poetic sense. It was measured, dated, and mapped wave height by wave height, sand layer by sand layer, by people patient enough to go looking for evidence buried under water and mud for thousands of years. The land itself may be gone. The record it left behind, as it turns out, was considerably harder to erase. Somewhere in a sediment core sitting in a laboratory refrigerator tonight, a thin, dark band of sand no wider than a finger is quietly holding the entire story of that morning, waiting for the next person patient enough to slice it open and examine it properly. And while an entire chapter of geography was disappearing beneath that same rising water, another kind of change, far slower and far quieter, but in its own way just as permanent, was already working its way through the very bodies of the people who survived it, reshaping height, bone, and health across generations in ways nobody living through it could have possibly noticed happening at all. Reshaping height, bone, and health across generations in ways nobody living through it could have possibly noticed happening at all. In central Illinois, along the Illinois River, sits a low rise of ground archaeologists called Dixon Mounds, a burial site, used by the same general population for several centuries, spanning exactly the stretch of time when that population shifted from hunting and gathering toward relying more and more heavily on farmed corn. A team of researchers led by an anthropologist named Alan Goodman, working alongside George Armelagos, spent years pulling skeleton after skeleton out of that ground and simply measuring them, cataloguing height, bone density, tooth condition, and the small telltale scars stress leaves behind on a growing body. Because the site had been used continuously by descendants of the same regional population layer after layer, generation folded neatly on top of generation, it offered something rare in this field, a single unbroken family story written directly into bone rather than a comparison between two entirely different, potentially unrelated groups of people living hundreds of miles apart. What they found, laid out generation by generation from the same stretch of riverbank, was not the story anyone expected walking in. People got shorter, people got sicker, and it happened gradually enough that nobody living through any single decade of it would likely have noticed a thing. Here's the reversal worth sitting with properly because it runs directly against almost everything popular imagination assumes about this whole chapter of human history. Farming is supposed to be the upgrade, reliable food, stored grain against a hard winter, an end to the uncertainty of chasing herds or waiting on wild plants to ripen on their own schedule. And yet, when anthropologists finally started digging up the actual skeletons left behind by that transition site after site, continent after continent, the bodies told a very different story than the one written in most textbooks. In 1984, two researchers, George Armalagos and Mark Nathan Cohen, pulled together the findings from more than 20 separate archaeological studies into a single book, examining exactly what happened to human bodies as different societies around the world shifted toward agriculture. Out of 21 distinct populations, they compared 19 showed measurable declines in health once farming took over. Not one or two outliers, 19 out of 21. The book landed as a genuine controversy at the time, openly challenged by other respected researchers who found the conclusions premature or overstated. A follow-up review published decades later, gathering fresh data from societies spanning 5 separate continents, found the same pattern holding up again and again, regardless of location, regardless of which specific crop a given culture happened to be growing. Here's a number worth sitting with directly. Comparing skeletons of hunter-gatherers to the farmers who lived on that same land not long afterward, researchers have measured average height dropping by something in the range of 10 centimeters, roughly 4 inches. In parts of Western Europe, the difference measured closer to 14 centimeters, for men 8 for women. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the pattern reversed slightly, 8 centimeters shorter, for men 11 for women. No matter how you slice the regional variation, the direction never really changes. Bodies across an enormous stretch of the ancient world simply stopped growing as tall as they once had. Try imagining for a moment walking into a family reunion and noticing that every single person born after a certain year stood noticeably shorter than everyone born before it, without a single person in the room able to explain exactly why, and without any of them having the faintest idea their own dinner plates were the reason. So what actually happened to those bodies and why? Wild hunted meat and gathered plants, whatever their other hardships, tend to deliver a truly varied mix of nutrients across a normal week. Dozens of different plant species, a wide range of proteins and fats depending on the season. Farming narrowed that variety down dramatically, often to 1 or 2 starchy staple crops eaten meal after meal, day after day, year after year. Grain fills a stomach efficiently. It does not necessarily fill a body's full nutritional needs the way a truly varied wild diet once did. On top of that, a population depending heavily on 1 or 2 crops now had a brand new kind of vulnerability baked directly into daily life. A single bad harvest, a single blight, a single unlucky season of drought could mean real sustained hunger for an entire community at once, in a way that a more varied hunting and foraging lifestyle rarely allowed for. Skeletons preserve this kind of stress in surprisingly specific ways if you know where to look. Teeth, it turns out, are one of the best witnesses history ever left behind. Enamel forms in careful orderly layers while a child is still growing, and a period of real malnutrition or illness leaves behind a visible horizontal groove in that enamel, a kind of scar frozen in place for thousands of years, readable under a microscope like a tree ring recording a hard season. Farming populations show these growth stress lines far more often and far more severely than the hunter-gatherers who came before them in the exact same regions. Cavities tell their own story too. A diet suddenly rich in soft, starchy, occasionally sugary grain gives the bacteria living in a human mouth exactly what they need to thrive, and the rate of tooth decay in early farming populations climbed sharply compared to their foraging ancestors whose diet simply gave those particular bacteria far less to work with. Here's a detail that tends to unsettle people the first time they hear it described properly. Along the roof of the eye sockets and sometimes across the outer surface of the skull itself, researchers frequently find small, porous, almost sponge-like patches of bone in skeletons from early farming communities, conditions researchers call cribra orbitalia and porotic hyperostosis. For a long stretch of the field's history, these were interpreted fairly confidently as direct evidence of iron deficiency anemia, a body's marrow working overtime to compensate for a shortage. More recent research has pushed back on reading that signal quite so simply, pointing out that parasites, inflammation, and other stresses entirely unrelated to diet can leave behind a very similar mark on bone. The honest picture today sits somewhere in between confidence and uncertainty. These lesions clearly mark some kind of real physical hardship endured in childhood. Exactly which hardship in any single skeleton is not always possible to say with full certainty anymore. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment if you're still comfortable enough to keep your mind wandering. Run your tongue gently along your own teeth right now if you'd like. Whatever is sitting there, filled cavities, sensitive spots, a crown from years ago carries at least a small echo of that same 10,000-year-old bargain, the one this whole species struck the moment grain became the center of the plate, rather than an occasional supplement to it. None of this stress arrived alone either. Farming did not just narrow diets, it also packed far more people into far smaller spaces than hunting and gathering ever required, and it placed those same people in far closer, far more constant contact with domesticated animals than anyone had ever lived with before. That combination turns out to be a remarkably efficient recipe for spreading infectious disease. Pathogens that had spent their entire evolutionary history circulating quietly inside cattle, pigs, and fowl suddenly had a brand new host species living near enough and densely enough to jump across that gap and take hold. Several of history's most persistent human diseases trace their earliest origins back to exactly this kind of species. Crossover measles believed to have first crossed over from cattle, several strains of influenza tracing back to domesticated pigs and waterfowl arriving as a direct, largely unplanned consequence of choosing to settle shoulder to shoulder with the very animals people had only recently begun keeping. If your body wants to sink a little further into wherever you're resting right now, let it. None of this needs to feel alarming from this distance. It happened a very long time ago to people who never had the chance to trace the pattern the way we can tonight, looking backward with the comfort of knowing exactly how the story eventually turned out. Take a moment, if you like, to notice your own breathing slow, your own limbs settle a little heavier against whatever is holding you up right now. There is no version of tonight's story that asks anything more of you than that. It is only fair, before we move any further, to be honest about the parts of this picture that are not perfectly settled either. A handful of the original studies included in that landmark 1984 review did not show the same clear decline, and some researchers, at the time among them respected demographers who studied population history, closely pushed back hard against the whole conclusion, arguing the case for declining health was weaker and messier than its authors were presenting it. Height itself complicates the picture further, since a large share of how tall any person ultimately grows comes down to inherited genetics rather than childhood nutrition alone. Roughly 4/5 of the height variation seen in living populations today traces back to genes rather than upbringing, which means shifting populations into marriage and migration could all be quietly tangled up inside these numbers alongside diet and disease. Maybe the decline really was as consistent and as sweeping as that original landmark study first suggested. A near universal cost paid almost everywhere farming took root. Maybe the true picture is patchier, stronger in some regions and crops than others, shaped as much by genetics and local circumstances by diet alone. Or maybe, and this feels like the fairest place to leave two entire generations of careful, occasionally sharp academic argument. Tonight, both threads are true at once, a real broad decline in individual health running alongside plenty of local exceptions, still waiting for someone patient enough to fully untangle them. There is something almost funny in a very quiet, very human way about how much of this entire debate keeps coming back to teeth. Careers built and occasionally unmade over a single line of thinned enamel, argued over by researchers who have devoted entire decades to reading childhood hunger out of a stranger's smile 10,000 years after that particular hunger passed. Somewhere in a university archive tonight, a drawer full of ancient jawbones sits labelled and numbered, waiting for the next graduate student patient enough to spend a summer squinting at grooves smaller than a fingernail. Here is the part of this story that deserves to sit with you the longest because it quietly reframes almost everything else we have covered together tonight. Even while individual bodies were growing shorter, weaker, and more disease-prone, the total number of people on this planet did the exact opposite. Farming whatever it cost any single person eating that narrower, starchier diet could feed far more mouths per acre than hunting and foraging ever managed, and populations relying on it grew explosively as a direct result. Researchers studying this exact tension have given it a name worth remembering. The difference between health and fitness, in the strict biological sense of that second word, are not actually the same measurement at all. In the cold arithmetic, evolution actually runs on more surviving children matters more than any individual's comfort, and by that particular measure, agriculture was not a mistake at all. It was in the most literal numerical sense, one of the most successful strategies our species has ever adopted, even as it made countless individual lives shorter, harder, and more painful than the lives their ancestors had lived before them. That is a strange, uncomfortable kind of success to sit with, honestly. A choice that quietly made millions of individual bodies worse off, while making the species as a whole larger, more numerous and more permanent than it had ever been before. Every single thread we have followed together tonight, the drowned lands, the vanished herds, the first seeds, the buried temple, the wave that closed one story and opened another, the shrinking bodies, we just spent time with all of it, eventually funnels down into exactly this, a body. Yours specifically, sitting exactly where you are right now, carrying the accumulated inheritance of every single choice, every single hardship, every single stubborn act of survival this story has walked through tonight. Bone density shaped by diet choices made 10,000 years before your own grandparents were born. Immune responses tuned by outbreaks that swept through crowded early farming villages long before anyone understood what a pathogen even was. A jaw slightly too small for the teeth still trying to grow inside it. What that inheritance actually looks like sitting quietly inside you at this very moment is where we are headed next. And it turns out to be closer and considerably more personal than you might expect. Closer and considerably more personal than you might expect. So let's go back just once more to where all of this actually began tonight. A trawler rocking gently on an ordinary night in the North Sea, hauling up a lump of ancient peat that should never have been sitting on the bottom of the ocean at all. Inside it, a single carved point made by somebody's hands on land that no longer exists anywhere except in old survey data and the occasional stubborn fisherman's memory. That one small object was never really the whole story. It was a thread. And across the last several hours, we've been quietly following that thread and dozens like it all the way back through the strangest, fastest, most consequential stretch of weather this planet has ever put a species through. Think back for just a moment over everything that thread ended up pulling loose. A grassland alive with more animals per square mile than anyone pictures when they hear the words Ice Age. A bone house in Ukraine built from the remains of dozens of mammoths discovered by a farmer who only wanted a bigger cellar. A single stubborn flower pressed flat in cold clay patiently waited on by a man who counted one good leaf as a full day's work. A piece of melted glass in Syria hot enough to embarrass every ordinary explanation anyone tried to offer first. A cylinder of ice 2 miles long holding the most honest weather diary this planet has ever kept. 2 vanished countries an ocean apart drowning at almost exactly the same moment, without either one knowing the other existed. A handful of giant gentle animals, some hunted, some simply out of luck. At least one small stubborn herd holding on for another 7,000 years on a lonely Arctic island. A quiet lakeshore in Israel, and a hillside in Turkey, where somebody first wondered whether wild grass might grow somewhere it had never grown on purpose before. A buried temple older than farming itself. A wave that finally closed the door on the very land we started with tonight. And a body quietly reshaped by all of it, still carrying the whole story forward every single day without asking permission. Here finally is an honest answer to the question sitting underneath everything we have walked through together tonight. What actually happened to the world and to the body carrying you through it right now when 100,000 years of ice came apart in what amounts to a single long exhale? It happened in pieces, and it happened almost everywhere at once. A grassland vanished and took entire species of giants down with it, some by hunger, some by spear, at least one small stubborn herd surviving on a lonely island long enough to watch the pyramids go up on the other side of the world. A flower pressed flat in cold mud turned out to be recording one of the sharpest climate reversals this planet has ever produced, discovered by a man patient enough to treat a single leaf as a good day's work. A rock, or something very much like one may have arrived from somewhere far outside this planet, entirely leaving behind melted glass and scattered platinum that scientists are still arguing over in quiet, respectful disagreement decades later. Ice drilled up in cylinders 2 miles long turned out to be the most honest diary this planet ever kept, recording a climate flipping from one state to another in less time than it takes to raise a child. Whole countries disappeared, not metaphorically. Actual walkable countries, Bringier in the north, Sunderland near the equator, homes to real families for thousands of years, quietly measured now only in genetics and old seabed surveys nobody built with archaeology in mind. And out of that same upheaval, almost as if the planet needed to balance the loss with something new, came grain deliberately planted for the first time, a temple raised by people who were not even supposed to have the organization for such a thing yet, and eventually a wave that finished off the last dry corner of a country. An entire trawler crew had unknowingly reached back into decades before anyone understood what they were holding, and through every single one of those chapters, quietly, patiently, without asking permission from anyone living through it, the human body itself kept changing right along with the world around it. Shorter in places, sicker for a while, more crowded, more exposed to disease, more dependent on a handful of crops than any hunter-gatherer ancestor ever had to be. And yet somehow more numerous than this species had ever managed to become before. Roughly 12,000 years separates that entire story from this exact moment. Wherever you happen to be resting right now, on the scale of a single life, that number is almost impossible to hold on to properly. On the scale of the planet itself, it barely counts as an afternoon. Here's the honest 3-part answer, if you have been waiting all night for something that ties the whole story into a single neat ribbon. Maybe the biggest single force behind everything we covered tonight really was the ice itself, one long, patient 100,000-year build-up, finally releasing all at once like a held breath letting go. Maybe it was closer to a chain reaction. One small trigger, a flood, a rock, an earthquake under the sea setting off a cascade no single cause fully explains on its own. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave an entire species origin story resting tonight, there was never one true cause at all, only an enormous tangled knot of ice water animals, plants, and stubborn inventive people, all pulling on each other at once in ways we're still only beginning to untangle from old bones and older mud. Whichever of those feels closest to true to you here is the part that is not really up for debate at all. You're still carrying every piece of it. Somewhere in the structure of your own teeth sits an echo of that first difficult harvest, a jaw slightly too small for a full set of adult teeth. Because your ancestors started eating soft-cooked, cultivated grain long before evolution had time to catch up and shrink the jaw to match it. Somewhere in your immune system sits a set of settings first tuned by crowded early farming villages, living closer to their animals than any hunter-gatherer band ever needed to. Somewhere in how your own body handles milk or grain, or the occasional stretch of real hunger, sits a set of choices made by people standing on a hillside in what is now Turkey, watching wild grass and wondering for the very first time in the whole history of this species whether they could make it grow exactly where they wanted. And somewhere quieter than any of that sits a body built to survive a world that could apparently flip from deep winter to something near spring in less time than it takes to finish raising a single child, because that is precisely the world your ancestors somehow lived through and stayed alive inside long enough to have you. It is worth noticing too that the very same ocean current we spent time with earlier tonight, the one that may have stumbled badly enough to plunge an entire hemisphere back into the cold, is still out there right now, still quietly moving warm water north from the tropics, still being watched carefully and patiently by scientists who have not forgotten what it did once before. Nobody sensible is predicting a repeat of anything you heard about tonight. But there is something oddly grounding in knowing that the exact same forces that shape this whole story are not locked away in some finished ancient past. They are still turning quietly underneath the very ocean sitting on the other side of whatever coastline is nearest to you right now. None of that is a flaw sitting inside you. It is closer to a signature. Proof written directly into your own body that every single ancestor standing between you and that vanished world of ice somehow made it through long enough to pass everything forward. The drowned lands, the missing giants, the first uncertain harvest, the buried temple, the wave. All of it survived quietly, patiently inside people, ordinary enough that history never bothered to write down a single one of their names. Every unbroken link in that chain had to eat, had to stay warm, had to find shelter from a world that kept changing its own rules without warning, and every single one of them managed it. Not one exception across 100 centuries. That is not a small thing to carry inside a single body. If your body's heavy, now let it stay exactly that heavy. There is nothing left tonight that needs your effort, just this settling in. There is something worth sitting with one last time about how this whole story chose to end up in your hands at all. None of what we covered tonight survived because anyone set out 11,000 years ago to leave a message for people who would not exist for another few hundred generations. A carved antler point was simply lost or left in a river. A bone house was simply abandoned when the hunting moved on. A temple was simply buried for reasons its own builders never explained to anyone who came after. Almost nothing about tonight's story was left on purpose. It survived by accident over and over again in mud and ice and stone, patient enough to wait until somebody curious enough finally came looking. A drought had to strike a lake in Israel at exactly the right decade. A farmer in Ukraine had to decide on one particular afternoon that his cellar needed to be a little bigger. An oil company had to go looking for stable seabed and stumble instead into a catastrophe. Story after story tonight saved from oblivion by nothing more reliable than pure ordinary coincidence. That is in its own quiet way one of the most comforting things this whole story has to offer. You do not need to build a monument or carve a message into stone or do anything remarkable at all for the ordinary shape of your life to matter, to ripple outward to become part of whatever comes next. The people whose bones and tools and half-buried homes carried us through this entire evening were almost without exception, doing nothing more dramatic than trying to get through an ordinary day. That turned out to be more than enough. It may still be more than enough now for whatever ordinary day is waiting for you once this one finally ends. It is worth admitting plainly before we wrap things up completely that not every piece of this puzzle is finished. Scientists are still arguing gently over exactly how fast that climate really flipped in different corners of the world. They are still working out whether a rock actually fell from the sky or whether water alone can explain everything. They're still counting rings in ancient bone and arguing politely decade after decade over what a single scorched hearth or a single porous patch of skull really proves. This entire field is in its own way still being written, one careful excavation at a time by people patient enough to spend a whole career on a single question most of us will never think to ask twice. That unfinished quality is not a weakness in the story. It might be the most honest part of it. 100,000 years is a very long time to fully understand in one evening, or honestly in one career or one lifetime, or possibly ever completely. Thank you sincerely for spending this stretch of your night here wherever in the world you happen to be listening from. Some of you are hearing this in the deep, quiet middle of the night curled up somewhere warm. Some of you caught this earlier on a long drive or folding laundry, or simply looking for something calm to sit with before the day properly ends. Whether you made it all the way to this final quiet moment wide awake or drifted off somewhere back around, that vanished herd of mammoths, or that carved antler point, or that first uncertain seed pressed into soil, all of it was worth sharing with you. There is a whole world of stories like this one still waiting, other lost lands, other stubborn survivors, other strange patient discoveries still sitting quietly in the dirt, and I would love nothing more than to bring the next one to you whenever you are ready to listen again. For now, let this be enough. The ice is gone. The world it left behind became this one, and somewhere in you, quietly, patiently, all of it is still here. Rest now. You have carried enough for tonight. Sleep well.